Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet journey into one of the most shadowed corners of the wizarding world. Tonight, we will move slowly through silence and cold, tracing the unseen weight carried by those who lived under the presence of Dementors. As you settle into stillness, allow the rhythm of this story to guide you gently, not toward fear, but toward understanding. We will begin far from warmth and comfort, on a distant island where the sea never rests, and where time itself seems to thin beneath the quiet, patient pull of memory. Far from the busy paths of the wizarding world, beyond the reach of ordinary travel, and far from any place where warmth might linger, there stood a fortress that few ever saw, and even fewer ever left behind. It rose from a small, jagged island in the cold northern sea, its stone walls darkened by years of storm and salt, its towers worn by winds that never seemed to rest. This was Azkaban, a place built not only to contain, but to isolate, to remove those within it from the rhythm of ordinary life until even memory began to feel distant. The sea that surrounded the island was rarely calm. Waves struck the rock with a steady, unchanging force, as if marking time in a place where time itself no longer held meaning. The sky above was often grey, heavy with cloud, allowing only the faintest light to reach the narrow windows set high in the fortress walls. There were no welcoming shores, no gentle approaches, only sharp stone and cold water stretching outward in every direction. Even before one stepped inside, there was a sense that this place existed apart from the rest of the world, as though it had been set aside for a purpose that others preferred not to think about. Unlike other prisons, Azkaban did not rely on thick bars or complex locks to hold its prisoners. The walls were strong, but they were not its greatest defense. The true barrier was something less visible, something that could not be broken or bypassed through strength or cleverness. Those who were brought here often arrived with fear, but what awaited them was not the kind of punishment they had imagined. There were no shouting guards, no constant movement, no structure that resembled ordinary confinement. Instead, there was stillness, and within that stillness, something far more difficult to endure. The interior of the fortress reflected the same quiet severity as the world outside. Long corridors stretched between cells, their stone floors worn smooth by years of use, though footsteps were rarely heard upon them. The air carried a constant chill, not the sharp cold of winter, but a deeper, heavier cold that seemed to settle into the body and remain there. Light, when it appeared at all, was dim and uncertain, filtering through narrow openings that allowed more shadow than illumination. It was a place where brightness struggled to exist, and where darkness did not need to try. Each cell was simple, almost bare. There was little to distinguish one from another, and little within them that could offer comfort. No personal objects, no reminders of life beyond the walls. The design was not meant to injure the body, but to remove everything that might anchor the mind. In such a space, even the smallest memory could become important, and even the smallest loss could grow into something overwhelming. For those who entered Azkaban, the journey itself marked a turning point. The moment of arrival was often quiet, without ceremony, without announcement. One step across the threshold, and the world they had known began to fall away. Voices faded. Familiar thoughts grew harder to hold. The presence of the sea, once distant, became something constant, its endless motion a reminder of a world that continued without them. What made this place truly different, however, was not its isolation or its structure, but the role it played in shaping the experience of those within it. Azkaban was not designed simply to hold prisoners until their sentences ended. It was designed to change them, slowly and steadily, until the person who had entered no longer remained in the same form. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded over days, then weeks, then months, each moment building upon the last in ways that were difficult to notice at first. At the edges of awareness, there was always something present, not a sound, not a movement that could be clearly seen, but a quiet pressure, like a weight resting just beyond perception. New arrivals often sensed it before they understood it, a subtle shift in the air, a feeling that the space around them was no longer empty. It was not an immediate threat, not something that struck quickly or violently. Instead, it waited, patient and constant, allowing the mind to adjust to its presence before revealing the full extent of its influence. In such a place, the idea of time began to lose its structure. Without clear markers, without change, hours blended into one another until they became indistinguishable. Days no longer felt separate. Nights brought no true rest, only a continuation of the same quiet existence. The passing of time could no longer be measured by events, only by the gradual shift within the mind itself. There were no voices offering reassurance, no signs that the outside world remembered those who had been sent here. Even the concept of distance began to fade. The island felt both vast and confined, its walls both enclosing and endless. It was possible to feel alone even while surrounded by others, each person isolated within their own space, their own thoughts, their own slow unraveling. And yet, despite all of this, Azkaban did not present itself as a place of sudden cruelty. It did not rely on visible violence or immediate suffering. Its effect was quieter, more persistent, unfolding in a way that was difficult to resist because it did not demand resistance. It simply existed, shaping the environment, shaping the experience, shaping the mind. In time, those who remained within its walls began to understand that the true nature of their confinement was not physical. The stone, the sea, the distance from the world, these were only the surface. What lay beneath was something far more enduring, something that could not be seen or touched, but could be felt in every moment. It was this unseen presence, this quiet force, that defined Azkaban more than any wall or tower ever could. And it was here, within this still and unchanging place, that the work of the Dementors began. To understand what happened to those who were sent to Azkaban, it becomes necessary to look more closely at the beings who shaped the experience of that place. They were not guards in the way one might expect, and not creatures that could be easily compared to anything familiar. They did not speak, did not argue, did not threaten. Their presence was quieter than that, and far more complete. They were known as Dementors, and even the name carried a weight that suggested something difficult to fully explain. Descriptions of them were often uncertain, shaped more by feeling than by sight. Those who had encountered them spoke of tall, cloaked figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, their forms obscured by darkness that clung to them like mist. Beneath the hood, there was rarely anything clearly seen, only the suggestion of something hidden, something that did not belong among the living. They did not rush forward, did not move with urgency. Instead, they approached slowly, as if time held no meaning for them, as if they understood that there was nowhere for their presence to be escaped. They were not human, and they had never been human. Unlike witches and wizards who chose their actions, Dementors did not act from intention in the same sense. They existed, and in existing, they fed. What they consumed was not physical in the ordinary way. They did not take food, did not require rest, did not depend on shelter or warmth. What sustained them was something less visible, yet more essential. They fed on human emotion, drawing in feelings in the same way breath is drawn into the lungs. But it was not all emotion that drew them. They were drawn to happiness, to hope, to the quiet warmth that exists within a person's memory of better times. These things, which often go unnoticed in ordinary life, became something tangible in their presence. It was as though joy itself could be tasted, and once found, it would be slowly and steadily consumed. What remained after that process was not empty space, but something far heavier, something that settled in place of what had been taken. Because of this, they could not be reasoned with or persuaded. They had no concept of fairness or mercy. They did not judge, did not distinguish between guilt and innocence in the way people might. They responded only to the presence of emotion, drawn to it without question, without hesitation. This made them both effective and deeply troubling as guardians, for they enforced confinement not through rules, but through their very nature. There were those who attempted to classify them, to understand where they came from or how they had come to exist. Some suggested that they were not created at all, but had formed naturally in places where despair had gathered over long periods of time. Others believed they were remnants of something older, something that existed alongside magic but was not part of it. Whatever their origin, it remained unclear, and perhaps that uncertainty added to the unease they inspired. They did not cast spells, nor did they wield wands. Their power did not resemble magic in the usual sense. It required no incantation, no gesture, no visible effort. It simply occurred as naturally as shadow follows light. When they were near, the world changed. The air grew colder, not sharply, but steadily, as though warmth were being drawn away. Light dimmed, colors faded, and sounds seemed to soften, as if the environment itself were responding to their presence. For those who encountered them, the experience was immediate, though not always understood at first. There was a sense of heaviness, a quiet pressure that settled into the chest, making it difficult to feel at ease. Thoughts became harder to hold, especially those that brought comfort. It was not that memories disappeared entirely, but that they grew distant, harder to reach, as if placed behind a barrier that could not be crossed. What remained, instead, were memories of a different kind, not chosen, not welcomed, but drawn forward by something outside of control. Moments of fear, regret, sorrow, these surfaced with clarity, repeating themselves in ways that felt unavoidable. It was as though the mind were being guided toward its darkest corners, and once there, unable to look away. Despite this, Dementors did not act with visible aggression. They did not strike, did not chase, did not demand. Their influence was constant rather than sudden, steady rather than explosive. This made their presence more difficult to resist, because there was no clear moment to defend against, no single action to prepare for. Instead, their effect unfolded gradually, shaping the experience of those around them in ways that became more noticeable only with time. In the context of Azkaban, this nature made them uniquely suited to their role. They did not need to watch every movement or enforce every rule. Their presence alone was enough to maintain control. Prisoners did not need to be restrained because the conditions created by the Dementors made resistance unlikely. Escape required not only physical strength, but clarity of thought and strength of will, both of which were slowly worn down under their influence. It is important to understand that Dementors did not take pleasure in what they did. They fed because it was their nature to do so, just as fire burns or water flows. This absence of intent made them more difficult to confront because there was nothing to appeal to, nothing to change. They could not be convinced to act differently because they were not choosing their actions at all. And so, within the walls of Azkaban, they existed as a constant presence, neither moving nor resting in ways that could be easily tracked. They were there in the corridors, in the spaces between cells, in the air itself, not always seen, but always felt. Over time, those who lived within that environment came to understand that the true nature of their confinement was not defined by stone or distance, but by this quiet, unchanging force that surrounded them. It was not a force that could be resisted through strength alone. It required something else, something far more fragile and far more difficult to maintain. And as the days passed, and the influence of the Dementors deepened, it became clear that this was precisely what made them so effective and so feared within the wizarding world. At first, their presence was not always understood. Those newly brought into Azkaban often noticed the change before they knew the cause, a quiet shift in the world around them that seemed small in isolation, but grew more difficult to ignore with each passing moment. It began with the air, which carried a chill unlike ordinary cold. It did not sting the skin or bite at the fingers, but settled deeper, as if it were seeping inward, touching something beneath the surface that could not be warmed. Light was among the first things to feel altered. Even when it entered through narrow windows, it seemed weaker than it should have been, unable to fully reach the corners of a cell or the far ends of a corridor. Shadows stretched farther, holding their place even when there was no reason for them to remain. Colors, once distinct, grew muted, as though they had been dimmed without anyone noticing the moment it happened. It was not darkness in the usual sense, but a quiet fading of brightness that made the world feel less defined. Sound, too, changed in subtle ways. The distant crash of waves against the island still continued, but it felt farther away, as if it were being heard through layers of distance that had not been there before. Footsteps echoed less clearly, voices seemed softer, and sometimes there was a strange absence of noise altogether, a stillness that made even the smallest sound feel out of place. In that silence, thoughts could become louder, but also less steady, as though they were slipping from one place to another without clear direction. For those who had not yet seen a Dementor, these changes were often confusing. There was no single moment that marked their arrival, no clear boundary between before and after. Instead, there was a growing awareness that something had entered the space, something that did not belong to the ordinary world. It was not always visible, but it could be felt, like a presence standing just beyond the edge of perception. As this awareness deepened, physical sensations followed. A heaviness began to settle in the body, not enough to prevent movement, but enough to make each action feel slower, more deliberate. Breathing became more noticeable, as though it required attention in a way it never had before. The simple act of standing or sitting carried a weight that had not been there previously, as if the body itself were responding to an unseen pressure. Alongside these physical changes came a shift in the mind. Thoughts that had once been clear and easy to follow began to drift. It became harder to focus on a single idea, harder to hold onto a memory with the same clarity. Familiar images, faces, voices, they remained, but seemed less immediate, less present. It was as though a distance had been placed between the person and their own mind, subtle at first, but steadily increasing. In their place, other thoughts began to surface. Not chosen, not invited, but drawn forward from somewhere deeper. Moments that had once been set aside returned with unexpected clarity. Regrets, fears, fragments of sorrow that might have been forgotten in another setting now stood closer to the surface, easier to reach, harder to ignore. They did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, each one settling in the space left behind by fading comfort. For many, this was the first true sign that the presence they felt was not passive. It was not simply observing or waiting, it was influencing, shaping the experience in ways that could not be fully controlled. The realization came slowly, often without a clear moment of understanding. But once it took hold, it became difficult to dismiss. When a Dementor came close enough to be seen, the earlier sensations began to make sense, though understanding did little to lessen their effect. The cloaked figure moved without sound, its form blending with the dimness of the surroundings, its approach steady and unhurried. There was no need for speed. Its presence alone was enough to create change, and that change deepened with proximity. The cold grew stronger, though it remained the same quiet, penetrating kind, reaching inward rather than outward. The light dimmed further, and the silence thickened until even the sound of breathing seemed distant. At this distance, the heaviness in the body became more pronounced, and the mind's ability to focus weakened further, as if something were gently but firmly pulling attention away from anything stable. It was not an attack in the usual sense. There was no sudden movement, no visible strike. Instead, there was a gradual shift, a drawing away of something essential. The person experiencing it might not immediately recognize what was being taken, only that something within them felt lighter in the wrong way, as though something important had been removed without leaving a clear absence behind. For those encountering this for the first time, The experience was often confusing before it became frightening. There was no clear enemy, no direct action to resist, only the growing awareness that the world had changed, and that the change was not temporary. The longer the presence remained, the more difficult it became to separate one's own thoughts from the influence surrounding them. These first signs were, in many ways, the beginning of the true punishment of Azkaban. Not a moment of violence, but the quiet introduction of something that would remain, shaping every moment that followed. It was subtle enough to go unnoticed at first, but persistent enough that it could not be ignored for long, and once recognized, it could not be forgotten. At first, the loss was difficult to name. Nothing visible disappeared, no object was taken, no sound removed. And yet, something within the mind began to change in a way that could not be easily explained. Thoughts that once carried warmth, even in small and ordinary ways, began to feel distant. A memory that might have once brought comfort no longer held the same weight. It was still there, unchanged in its details, but its feeling had softened, as though a layer had been quietly lifted away. This was how the process began, not with sudden emptiness, but with a gradual thinning of something that had always been present. A laugh remembered from long ago might still be recalled, but without the sense of joy that once accompanied it. A moment of kindness, once vivid and reassuring, now felt flat, like an image viewed from behind glass. The connection between memory and feeling, once immediate and effortless, began to weaken. For those within Azkaban, this change was often noticed only after it had already begun. There was no clear point at which it started, no moment that could be identified as the beginning. Instead, there was a slow realization that something familiar no longer felt the same. It was subtle enough to question, easy to dismiss at first, but persistent enough that it returned again and again. The presence of the Dementors moved through this process with quiet consistency. They did not need to act in visible ways. Their influence unfolded naturally, as if the environment itself had shifted in response to them. Where once there had been variation in thought and feeling, there was now a narrowing, a gradual movement toward a single, unchanging state. Happiness, in its many forms, was the first to fade. Not only the brightest memories, but also the smaller ones, the quiet moments that might not have seemed important before. The feeling of sunlight on skin, the sound of a familiar voice, the sense of safety that comes from being known by others. These things did not vanish completely, but they became harder to reach, less immediate, as if they were being placed further and further away. At the same time, other memories began to take their place, not by force, not through sudden intrusion, but by the simple fact that there was now more space for them to exist. Without the balance of positive feeling, the mind began to lean toward what remained: regret, fear, sorrow. These were not removed by the Dementors, they were left untouched, and in that imbalance, they grew more prominent. The experience was not one of constant intensity. There were moments when the change seemed less noticeable, when the mind attempted to return to what it had once been. A person might try to recall a happy memory, to hold on to it, to rebuild the feeling that had once come so easily. But the effort required became greater with time, and the result less certain. The memory might remain clear, but the emotion it carried would not fully return. This created a quiet kind of frustration, not sharp enough to overwhelm, but steady enough to wear down resistance. The more one tried to hold on to what had been lost, the more apparent the loss became. And in that awareness, the process continued, not with urgency, but with patience. It is important to understand that this removal of happiness did not occur all at once. It unfolded gradually, over hours and days, then weeks and longer stretches of time that were difficult to measure. Each moment built upon the last, each small change adding to the overall effect until the difference between before and after became unmistakable. For some, the realization came slowly. For others, it arrived more suddenly, in the recognition that something essential was no longer present. The ability to feel joy, even in memory, had been diminished to the point where it could no longer be relied upon. What had once been a source of strength had become uncertain, fragile, and difficult to maintain. In this way, the Dementors did not simply take happiness, they altered the structure of experience itself. Without the presence of positive emotion, the mind lost its balance. There was no longer a contrast between light and dark, only a steady movement toward one side. The absence of joy made sorrow more noticeable, not because it had grown stronger, but because nothing remained to offset it. This imbalance affected not only how prisoners felt, but how they thought. Decisions became slower, less certain. Motivation weakened, as there was little to move toward and nothing to look forward to. Even the concept of future began to lose meaning, as hope itself became harder to access. Without hope, time stretched in a way that felt empty rather than full, each moment passing without direction. What remained was a quiet persistence, a continuation of existence without the elements that once made it meaningful. The body continued, the mind continued, but something within had shifted in a way that could not be easily reversed. The removal of happiness was not simply the loss of pleasure. It was the loss of a foundation upon which other thoughts and feelings had once rested. And as this process continued, as each day brought a little more distance from what had once been, it became clear that this was not a temporary condition. It was not something that would pass with time or improve with effort. It was a steady, ongoing change, guided by a presence that did not need to hurry because it would not leave. In the quiet, dim spaces of Azkaban, this was how the transformation began, not with visible force, but with the slow and careful removal of something essential, leaving behind a mind that could still remember happiness, but could no longer feel it in the same way. As the presence of the Dementors continued to shape the space within Azkaban, the mind began to respond in ways that were both familiar and deeply altered. Memories, which had once appeared in gentle and chosen patterns, no longer followed the same quiet order. Instead, they rose without invitation, drawn forward by something that seemed to reach beneath the surface of thought and bring into focus what had once been pushed aside. At first, these memories arrived as fragments, a moment of discomfort, a feeling of regret, a brief image tied to a past mistake. They did not seem unusual on their own, as such thoughts often appear in ordinary life. But here, within the steady influence of the Dementors, they lingered longer than expected. They did not pass easily. They remained, repeating themselves with a clarity that made them difficult to ignore. Over time, these fragments grew more complete. Scenes that had once been distant returned with detail. Voices could be heard again, not faintly, but with a presence that felt immediate. The surroundings of those moments became clearer, as if the mind were being guided to reconstruct them with care. What had once been a memory now felt closer to an experience, unfolding again rather than simply recalled. This shift changed the nature of memory itself. It was no longer something that could be observed from a distance. Instead, it became something to be endured. The line between past and present began to soften, and with it, the ability to step away from what was being remembered. A moment of fear from years before could feel as near as the present, its weight returning in full, without the comfort of knowing that it had already passed. The Dementors did not create these memories. They did not invent new fears or place new images into the mind. What they did was draw forward what already existed, selecting from within a person's own experiences the moments that carried the greatest weight. These were not random choices, but patterns shaped by the mind itself, guided toward what had the deepest impact. For many prisoners, this meant returning again and again to the same few moments, times of loss, of failure, of harm given or received. Each repetition made the memory more difficult to escape, not because it grew stronger, but because it remained constant while other thoughts faded. Without the balance of positive memory, there was little to interrupt its presence. In this way, memory became something closer to a cycle. A person might attempt to think of something else, to shift their attention away from what was unfolding within their mind. But the effort required to do so increased over time, and the result became less certain. The unwanted memory would return, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a brief pause, but always with the same quiet persistence. There were moments when the intensity of these experiences deepened, not through sudden change, but through accumulation. Each return added another layer, another sense of familiarity that made the memory feel more present, more immediate. The distinction between remembering and reliving grew less clear, until the two began to feel the same. For those who experienced this, the effect was not always one of outward distress. There were no visible signs that marked the beginning or end of these internal moments. A person might sit in silence, their surroundings unchanged, while within their mind, a past event unfolded again with full clarity. The absence of visible struggle made the experience more isolated, more difficult to share or explain. One well-known example illustrates this process with particular clarity. A young wizard, upon encountering a Dementor, found himself hearing a voice he had never consciously remembered before. It was the voice of his mother in the final moments before her death. The words repeated, not as distant echoes, but as if they were happening again in the present. The fear, the urgency, the loss, all returned with a force that could not be softened by time. What made this experience significant was not only the content of the memory, but the way in which it was brought forward. It was not chosen, not recalled through effort. It emerged on its own, shaped by the presence of the Dementor, revealing something that had remained hidden beneath the surface of conscious thought. In this way, the Dementor did not introduce new suffering, but uncovered what had already existed. For prisoners within Azkaban, this process continued without interruption. There was no clear end, no moment when the mind could rest from these repeated experiences. Each memory, once brought forward, remained close, ready to return again. Over time, the repetition itself became part of the burden, adding a sense of inevitability to what was being endured. As this continued, the mind's ability to create new thoughts began to weaken. The focus remained fixed on what had already happened, with little room for anything else. The future became difficult to imagine, and the present lost its sense of movement. Everything seemed to point backward, toward moments that could not be changed, but could not be left behind. This was how memory became a tool within Azkaban, not through force, but through persistence. The Dementors did not need to act directly. Their presence shaped the conditions in which the mind operated, guiding it toward what was already there and allowing that to take hold. The result was a form of suffering that was both personal and inescapable, built entirely from within, yet influenced by something beyond control. In the quiet spaces of the prison, this process continued, unseen but constant, turning memory from a reflection of the past into something that felt as real and immediate as the present itself. As the days continued without clear division, the changes within the mind began to extend beyond memory alone. What had first appeared as a shift in feeling, then a repetition of past moments, slowly moved into something deeper. It was no longer only about what a person remembered, but about how they understood themselves within those memories. The connection between past and present, once steady and reliable, began to loosen. At first, this change was difficult to notice. A prisoner might find it harder to recall certain details, not entire events, but small parts of them. A name might take longer to surface. A place might appear less clearly. These moments could be dismissed, attributed to distraction or fatigue. But over time, they became more frequent and more difficult to ignore. Without the presence of happiness to anchor memory, the structure of identity began to weaken. A person is often defined not only by what they have experienced, but by how those experiences are held and understood. When the emotional connection to those experiences fades, what remains can feel distant, almost unfamiliar. This created a quiet separation, not between different thoughts, but between the person and their own sense of who they were. A prisoner might recall a moment from earlier in life, but find it difficult to feel that it truly happened to them. It would seem more like a story, something observed rather than lived. The certainty that once came with personal memory began to soften. As this continued, the idea of self became less stable. Without strong connections to positive memory, and with negative memory repeating in cycles, the balance that once shaped identity began to shift. The mind, lacking variation, moved toward a narrower understanding of experience. Instead of a wide range of thoughts and feelings, there was a gradual focus on a smaller set of recurring ideas. In this narrowing, identity began to lose its complexity. The many parts that once formed a person's sense of self, their relationships, their interests, their hopes, became harder to access. What remained were simpler, more immediate impressions, often tied to the strongest memories that had been brought forward. Over time, these impressions could begin to feel like the entirety of the self. For some, this resulted in a quiet confusion. They could remember who they had been, but could not fully connect to that version of themselves. The difference between past and present became difficult to define. The person they once were seemed distant, while the person they were becoming was not clearly understood. This uncertainty did not always appear as distress. Often, it was simply a lack of clarity, a sense that something was missing without being able to name what it was. For others, the process was more direct. The repeated exposure to certain memories, especially those tied to regret or fear, began to shape their understanding of themselves. If a person was made to relive a moment of failure again and again, it became easier to see that moment as defining. Without other memories to balance it, the idea of self could begin to center around that single experience. This was not a conscious decision, but a gradual shift. The mind, working within the conditions created by the Dementors, adapted to what was most available. With positive memory fading and negative memory repeating, identity began to align with what remained. As time passed, the ability to resist this change weakened. Holding on to a broader sense of self required effort, and that effort became harder to sustain. Without support, without variation, without the presence of new experience, the mind settled into patterns that were easier to maintain. These patterns were not chosen, but they were stable, and in a place where stability was rare, they could take hold. In this way, the loss of identity did not happen all at once. It was not a sudden forgetting, but a gradual reshaping. Each small change added to the next, until the difference between what had been and what remained became difficult to measure. The person who had entered Azkaban still existed, but in a form that was less complete, less connected, and more limited than before. There were moments when fragments of the past would return with clarity, a sudden memory of a familiar place, a brief sense of recognition that felt strong and immediate. But these moments were often short, and without the emotional strength to support them, they faded quickly. What remained afterward was not the memory itself, but the awareness that it could not be held. This awareness added another layer to the experience. Not only was identity becoming less clear, but the loss of it was being recognized. A person might understand that they were changing, that something within them was slipping away, but be unable to stop the process. This created a quiet tension, not always expressed outwardly, but present within the mind. Over longer stretches of time, even this awareness could begin to fade. As the structure of identity weakened, the ability to reflect on that change diminished. The process continued, but the recognition of it became less certain. What had once been a clear sense of self became something more distant, more difficult to define, until it no longer held the same importance. In the stillness of Azkaban, this transformation unfolded without interruption. There were no moments of renewal, no experiences to restore what had been lost. The conditions remained constant, and within those conditions, the mind adjusted as it could. Identity, once shaped by a wide range of thoughts and feelings, became simpler, narrower, and more fragile. And in that narrowing, the person who remained was no longer the same as the one who had entered. Not because they had been forced into a new form, but because the elements that once defined them had been slowly, quietly, and steadily worn away. In time, the experience of Azkaban settled into a quieter form, one that was no longer defined by sudden awareness or the sharp return of memory, but by something more constant and more difficult to describe. The early stages had carried confusion, the gradual loss of warmth, the repeated surfacing of painful moments. But as these processes continued without interruption, they gave way to a different state, one where intensity was replaced by absence. The mind, having been drawn again and again toward its most difficult memories, began to lose the strength required to respond to them in the same way. What had once felt overwhelming no longer carried the same sharpness. The images remained, the events unchanged, but the reaction to them began to dull. It was not relief, nor was it recovery. It was a quiet reduction, a lessening of response that left the memory present, but without the force it once held. This change extended beyond memory into the broader experience of thought and feeling. Emotions that had once moved freely, rising and falling with the rhythm of experience, became slower, less distinct. The contrast between one feeling and another grew less noticeable. Where there had once been variation, there was now a steadier, flatter state that remained largely unchanged from one moment to the next. In this state, even distress began to take on a different form. It was no longer sharp or immediate, but distant, as though it were being observed rather than felt directly. A person might recognize that a thought carried weight, that it was tied to something important, but the emotional response that should accompany it no longer arrived with the same clarity. This created a quiet separation between understanding and feeling, where one could exist without the other. The environment of Azkaban reinforced this shift. The constant cold, the dimness, the absence of sound, all contributed to a sense of stillness that did not change. Without variation in the world outside, the mind found little to respond to, and over time, it adapted by reducing its own movement. Thoughts became fewer, emotions more contained, reactions slower to form. There were moments when this stillness felt almost complete. A prisoner might sit within their cell, aware of their surroundings, aware of their own presence, but without any strong sense of feeling attached to that awareness. It was not sleep, nor was it rest. It was a kind of quiet existence, where time passed without leaving a clear impression. In such moments, the absence of sound became more noticeable than any noise. There were no voices, no conversations, no reminders of connection. Even the distant sounds of the sea seemed muted, as though they belonged to another place entirely. The silence was not empty, but full in a different way, holding within it the weight of everything that was no longer present. For those who experienced this state, the earlier intensity of memory could feel far away. The repetition of painful moments had not stopped, but it no longer carried the same immediate impact. Instead, it existed as part of the background, something that could be noticed, but not fully engaged with. The mind, having been exposed to it for so long, had adjusted by stepping back. This adjustment did not bring comfort. It removed the sharp edges of suffering, but it also removed the ability to feel anything else. Without the presence of positive emotion, and with the dulling of negative response, what remained was a narrow range of experience that changed very little over time. It was not peace, but a kind of quiet persistence, where the absence of feeling became the dominant condition. The body reflected this change as well. Movements became slower, not because of physical limitation, but because there was little reason to move quickly. Without urgency, without motivation, actions lost their sense of direction. Sitting, standing, walking, These became simple processes without meaning beyond their immediate function. There was no anticipation, no goal attached to them, only the continuation of movement itself. In this state, the idea of expression also began to fade. There were few outward signs of what was occurring within the mind, because there was little that could be expressed. Words, if spoken, would have carried little variation, little emotion. Over time, even the desire to speak diminished, replaced by the same quiet stillness that shaped every other part of the experience. It is in this way that the silence of Azkaban became more than the absence of sound. It became a condition that extended into thought and feeling, shaping not only what was experienced, but how it was experienced. The space between moments grew wider, not in time, but in meaning. Each moment passed without leaving a strong impression, blending into the next without distinction. For some, this state might have appeared calm from the outside. There were no visible struggles, no signs of distress that could be easily observed. But within that calm was the result of a long process, one that had removed much of what once defined the inner life of a person. What remained was not peace, but a quiet emptiness that carried its own weight. And in that emptiness, the presence of the Dementors continued, not through action, but through the conditions they maintained. They did not need to move or change what they were doing. Their influence had already taken hold, shaping the environment and the mind in ways that no longer required constant attention. This was the stage where suffering no longer needed to be intense to be complete. It existed in the absence of variation, in the quiet persistence of a state that did not change. And for those who remained within it, the silence became not something they experienced, but something they became part of. In most places of confinement, the idea of escape remains present, even if only as a distant thought. Walls are built to be climbed, locks are made to be broken, and distance can, in theory, be crossed. The possibility may be small, but it exists. And with it comes a certain kind of tension, a quiet calculation of what might be attempted under the right conditions. Within Azkaban, however, this idea took on a different form, not because escape was impossible in a physical sense, but because the conditions required to attempt it no longer remained. The structure of the fortress itself was formidable, rising from the sea with little to offer in the way of approach or departure. The surrounding waters were cold and relentless, stretching outward without visible end. Even for a strong swimmer, the journey would have been difficult, and for someone weakened by confinement, nearly unthinkable. Yet the physical challenge, while significant, was not the true barrier that kept prisoners in place. What made Azkaban different was the absence of resistance. In other prisons, the desire to leave remains active, shaping thought and action, even when escape is unlikely. Here, that desire began to fade, not through force, but through the same gradual process that affected memory and emotion. Without hope, without a sense of future, the idea of leaving lost its urgency, then its clarity, and eventually its presence altogether. The influence of the Dementors played a central role in this shift. As they fed on positive emotion and left behind a narrower range of feeling, the motivation required for escape became harder to sustain. Planning required focus, and focus required clarity. Both were diminished over time. Even if a prisoner could imagine a way out, holding on to that thought long enough to act upon it became increasingly difficult. In addition to this, the repeated return of painful memories created a kind of inward focus that drew attention away from the external world. The mind, occupied with what had already happened, had little space left to consider what might happen next. The future became abstract, distant, and without clear shape. In such a state, the effort required to plan an escape felt disproportionate to the uncertain result. There was also the matter of strength, not only physical, but mental. To attempt escape required a level of determination that depended on belief that something better existed beyond the walls, and that reaching it was possible. As this belief weakened, so too did the energy required to act. What remained was a quiet acceptance, not always conscious, but present in the absence of resistance. This did not mean that every prisoner abandoned the idea entirely. There were moments when the thought of escape would return, brief and uncertain, like a memory that had not fully faded. A person might consider the distance to the water, the height of the walls, the possibility of movement during a rare moment of distraction. But these thoughts rarely developed into plans. They appeared, lingered for a short time, and then slipped away, replaced by the same steady condition that shaped everything else. The design of Azkaban relied on this process. It did not need constant enforcement because the conditions themselves maintained control. The Dementors did not need to watch every cell or patrol every corridor. Their presence ensured that the prisoners remained where they were, not through fear alone, but through the gradual removal of the will to leave. This created a form of confinement that was both complete and quiet. There were no frequent attempts to escape, no signs of struggle against the boundaries of the prison. The stillness observed within its walls was not the result of strict discipline, but of a deeper change in the minds of those confined. Movement was limited, not by barriers alone, but by the absence of intent. For those observing from the outside, this might have appeared as an effective system, one that maintained order without visible effort. But this effectiveness came at a cost that was not easily measured. It required the erosion of qualities that extended beyond behavior, affecting the very capacity to choose, to act, and to hope. In this way, the lack of bars or constant supervision did not indicate freedom within the prison, but rather a different kind of control, one that operated not through restriction of movement, but through the shaping of thought and feeling. The prisoner remained in place not because they were physically unable to leave, but because the idea of leaving no longer held the same meaning. There were rare exceptions, individuals who, through unusual circumstances, retained enough clarity to consider escape as more than a distant possibility. Their presence within Azkaban revealed that the system was not absolute, that under certain conditions, resistance could still exist, but these cases were uncommon and often required factors that were not available to most. For the majority, the experience remained the same. The world beyond the walls grew distant, not only in space, but in relevance. The sea that surrounded the island was no longer something to cross, but something that simply existed. The walls were not obstacles to overcome, but part of a larger condition that defined their reality. In this environment, the concept of confinement took on a different meaning. It was not only about being held in a place, but about being shaped by that place in ways that made leaving it unlikely. The absence of bars was not a sign of leniency, but of a system that no longer required them. And so, within Azkaban, prisoners remained, not through force alone, but through a quiet and steady process that removed the very impulse to resist. Over time, the changes that began within the mind did not remain separate from the body. Though the Dementors did not inflict physical harm in the usual sense, their presence carried effects that reached beyond thought and feeling. The quiet removal of warmth, the steady loss of energy, and the narrowing of emotional experience began to shape the physical condition of those within Azkaban in ways that were gradual but unmistakable. At first, the body responded to the environment with subtle adjustments. The cold that filled the air did not pass as it might in other places. It remained constant, settling into muscles and joints, making movement feel heavier than before. A simple action, such as standing or walking across the small space of a cell, required more effort than it once had. There was no sharp pain, no immediate discomfort, only a steady resistance that made each movement slower. This physical heaviness was not caused by injury or illness in the ordinary sense. It was connected to the same influence that shaped the mind, the same quiet presence that reduced warmth and diminished energy. As positive feeling faded, so too did the natural sense of vitality that often accompanies it. The body, responding to the state of the mind, began to reflect that absence in its own way. Hunger, when it appeared, was less urgent. Food was provided, but the desire to eat did not always follow. Without strong feeling, the motivation to care for the body weakened. Meals became something to acknowledge rather than something to seek. Over time, this reduced attention to basic needs contributed to a gradual decline in physical strength. Sleep, too, changed in character. It did not arrive easily, nor did it provide the same sense of rest. The mind, caught between repetition and emptiness, did not settle in the way it might in a place of comfort. Nights passed without clear division from days, and when sleep did come, it was often shallow, interrupted, or difficult to distinguish from waking thought. The result was a form of exhaustion that did not resolve with time. As days continued without variation, the body adapted to a lower level of activity. Muscles that were once used regularly became less engaged. Strength diminished, not through sudden loss, but through lack of use combined with the ongoing influence of the environment. Movements that once required little effort became more demanding, and the range of motion narrowed to what was necessary for simple existence. The cold remained constant throughout this process. It was not a temperature that could be measured in ordinary terms, but a persistent absence of warmth that affected the body from within. Even when covered, even when still, the sensation did not change. It was as though the source of warmth had been removed rather than reduced, leaving behind a condition that could not be corrected through ordinary means. This absence of warmth contributed to a further slowing of the body's responses. Reflexes dulled, not sharply, but gradually. The time between thought and action increased, making each movement feel delayed. This delay was not always noticeable at first, but over longer periods, it became part of the overall condition, another element of the steady decline. Breathing, like other functions, became more deliberate. The air itself felt heavier, and drawing it in required attention that had once been automatic. There was no obstruction, no visible barrier, only a subtle resistance that made each breath more noticeable. Over time, this contributed to a sense of effort that extended even into the most basic aspects of living. In addition to these changes, there was a general reduction in physical resilience. Minor discomforts, which might have been ignored in other circumstances, became more persistent. The body, lacking the support of strong emotional energy and consistent care, had less capacity to recover from strain. This did not result in sudden illness, but in a gradual weakening that made the overall condition more difficult to endure. The combination of these factors created a state in which the body and mind reflected each other. As the mind lost variation and strength, the body followed. As the body weakened, the ability to act within the environment diminished further. This cycle reinforced itself, each element contributing to the next without clear separation. Despite this decline, there were few outward signs that marked the process clearly. There were no dramatic changes, no visible transformations that could be easily observed. Instead, the shift was seen in the accumulation of small differences, each one adding to the overall effect until the contrast between past and present became clear only when considered over longer periods. For those within Azkaban, this physical change was not always the focus of attention. The mind, occupied with memory and the absence of feeling, did not always register the gradual weakening of the body. Only when movement became noticeably more difficult, or when the effort required for simple tasks increased beyond what could be ignored, did the physical condition come into clearer awareness. Even then, the response to this awareness was limited. Without strong motivation or clear purpose, there was little inclination to resist or correct the decline. The body continued as it could, adapting to the conditions imposed upon it, while the mind adjusted in parallel. In this way, the effect of the Dementors extended beyond the emotional and into the physical, not through direct action, but through the environment they created. The absence of warmth, the reduction of energy, and the steady narrowing of experience combined to produce a state in which the body itself became part of the confinement. And within that state, the distinction between physical and mental suffering became less clear, each one reflecting the other in a quiet and continuous process that defined life within Azkaban. Within Azkaban, the passage of time did not follow the patterns most people rely upon to understand it. There were no clear markers to divide one day from the next, no meaningful changes in light or activity to signal movement forward. The same dim glow lingered without variation. The same cold remained without relief, and the same silence stretched across every hour. Without contrast, time began to lose its shape. At first, a prisoner might attempt to keep track. These efforts could provide a brief sense of structure, a way to hold on to the idea that time was still moving. But maintaining this awareness required focus, and focus was something that became more difficult to sustain. As the influence of the Dementors deepened, attention drifted. Thoughts that once followed a steady path began to wander, making it harder to maintain a consistent sense of sequence. A person might begin counting, only to lose track partway through, uncertain of how much time had passed. The attempt to rebuild that count often felt unnecessary, and gradually, the effort to measure time began to fade. Without these markers, days no longer felt distinct. One period blended into the next without clear separation. The idea of morning or evening held little meaning when the environment remained unchanged. Even sleep, when it came, did not divide time in a reliable way. It arrived without clear pattern and passed without leaving a strong sense of rest, making it difficult to use as a reference point. This lack of structure affected more than perception. It altered the way experience itself was understood. In ordinary life, time provides a framework that gives meaning to events. Moments are connected through sequence, creating a sense of progression. In Azkaban, that framework weakened. Events, such as they were, felt isolated rather than connected, existing without a clear before or after. Memory, already influenced by the presence of the Dementors, became further detached from the passage of time. A past event might feel close, not because it had happened recently, but because it remained vivid in the mind. Meanwhile, more recent moments could feel distant or indistinct, lacking the emotional clarity needed to anchor them. This inversion made it difficult to determine what belonged to the present and what belonged to the past. For some, this created a sense of disorientation. They could not easily place themselves within a timeline, uncertain of how long they had been within the prison or how much time remained. The future, already difficult to imagine, became even more abstract. Without a clear sense of progression, it lost its connection to the present entirely, becoming something undefined and unreachable. Over longer periods, this disorientation gave way to a different state. The need to understand time diminished, replaced by a quiet acceptance of its absence. A prisoner no longer attempted to measure or track it, because doing so offered little benefit. The concept of waiting, which depends on an awareness of time, became less relevant. There was nothing specific to wait for, and no clear indication of when anything might change. In this way, time itself became another element of the confinement, not through restriction, but through removal of its usual function. Without structure, it no longer provided meaning or direction. It simply existed, moving forward in a way that could not be easily perceived or engaged with. The body reflected this change as well. Without routine, actions lost their place within a larger sequence. Eating, resting, moving, these became isolated acts rather than parts of a daily pattern. There was no rhythm to follow, no expectation of when something would occur. Each action stood alone, disconnected from what came before or after. This absence of rhythm contributed to the overall stillness of the environment. Without regular activity, without variation, the sense of motion within the prison diminished. It was not that time had stopped, but that its movement no longer carried the same significance. Each moment felt similar to the last, creating a continuous stretch of experience without clear boundaries. There were rare instances when an external event might briefly interrupt this continuity: the sound of movement in a corridor, the presence of another figure passing nearby, a shift in the environment that broke the pattern. These moments could provide a temporary sense of distinction, a reminder that change was possible, but they were brief, and once they passed, the same steady condition returned. For those within Azkaban, this altered experience of time became part of their reality. It did not need to be considered or understood in a conscious way. It was simply the way things were. The absence of structure, the blending of moments, the quiet persistence of each passing second, all combined to create an environment where time no longer served its usual purpose. And in that environment, the mind adjusted as it could, finding ways to exist without the framework it once relied upon. The result was not a complete loss of awareness, but a different kind of awareness, one that no longer depended on sequence or progression, but existed within the steady, unchanging flow of the present. Within the walls of Azkaban, time did not disappear. It continued, as it always does. But without structure, without variation, without meaning, it became something that could no longer be easily held or understood, another quiet element of the experience shaped by the presence of the Dementors. There was, within the presence of the Dementors, a final act that stood apart from everything that came before it. Unlike the slow and gradual changes that shaped the experience of Azkaban over time, this act was immediate, deliberate in its approach, and irreversible in its result. It was known quietly among the wizarding world, spoken of with a kind of distant caution, as the Dementor's kiss. For most prisoners, the existence of this act remained something abstract, a possibility rather than an experience. They lived within the steady influence of the Dementors, enduring the loss of warmth, the fading of memory, and the narrowing of self, without ever reaching this final stage. But the knowledge of it, even when not directly encountered, carried its own weight, adding a deeper layer to the understanding of what the Dementors were capable of. The approach of a Dementor in this context was different from its usual presence. It did not linger at a distance or move past without pause. Instead, it drew closer with a steady and unmistakable purpose. The air, already cold, seemed to settle further, and the quiet of the space deepened into something more complete. There was no need for sudden movement, no urgency in the act itself. It unfolded with the same patient stillness that defined everything the Dementors did. When the moment came, the Dementor lowered its hood, revealing what was usually kept hidden. Those who had seen it rarely described it in clear detail, not because it was impossible to see, but because it was difficult to explain in terms that felt complete. There was a suggestion of form, something that did not resemble the face of any living being, something that existed outside of familiar understanding. It was not the appearance alone that held significance, but what followed. The Dementor drew close enough that the distance between it and the prisoner disappeared entirely. There was no resistance in the ordinary sense. The body, already weakened, the mind already shaped by its presence, could not respond in a way that would alter the outcome. The act did not rely on strength or force, but on the same quiet inevitability that defined the Dementor's nature. What was taken in that moment was not memory, not thought, not emotion alone, but something deeper, something that existed beneath all of these. It was often described as the soul, though the word itself did not fully capture what was lost. It was the part of a person that gave meaning to thought, that allowed memory to feel personal, that connected experience to identity. Without it, the remaining body and mind could continue, but in a different form. The process was not prolonged. It did not unfold over hours or days. It occurred in a single, continuous action, one that left no visible mark, no sign that could be easily observed from the outside. And yet, the change it created was complete. Where there had once been a person with thoughts, feelings, and identity, there remained only the structure of a body, still alive, still breathing, but no longer carrying the same presence within. Those who witnessed the aftermath often struggled to describe it. The individual remained physically present, capable of movement, capable of basic function, but there was an absence that could not be overlooked. The eyes, once reflective of thought and feeling, no longer held the same depth. Expressions, if they appeared at all, lacked variation. There was no clear indication of awareness, no sign that the inner life of the person continued in any meaningful way. This state was not considered death, and yet it was often regarded as something more final. Death, in its usual understanding, carries with it a sense of ending, a completion of life that, while difficult, is clear in its outcome. The Dementors' kiss left something behind, but what remained was not life as it had been known. It was a continuation without presence, an existence without the elements that gave it meaning. Because of this, the act was reserved for only the most extreme circumstances. It was not part of ordinary punishment, but something used sparingly, often under the authority of the Ministry of Magic. Even then, its use carried a sense of unease, an understanding that it crossed a boundary that few other actions approached. Within Azkaban, the possibility of the kiss added another layer to the experience of confinement. It was not always at the forefront of thought, but it remained present as an understanding of what could happen if certain conditions were met. This knowledge did not always produce fear in the usual sense, as the capacity for strong emotion had already been diminished. Instead, it existed as a quiet awareness, another element of the environment that shaped the mind. For those who had already experienced the gradual loss of happiness, the repetition of painful memory, and the weakening of identity, the idea of losing what remained could feel distant, almost abstract, and yet it marked a clear boundary, a point beyond which the process of change would no longer continue, because there would be nothing left to change. In this way, the Dementors' kiss stood apart from the rest of their influence. Where the earlier stages were defined by gradual transformation, this was defined by completion. It did not reshape the mind or alter experience. It removed the foundation upon which experience existed at all. And within the quiet, unchanging space of Azkaban, it remained as the final expression of what the Dementors were capable of, a single act that revealed, with clarity, the full extent of their nature. After the moment of the kiss had passed, what remained was not easily understood within the usual terms of life or death. The body continued, sustained in the same quiet way as before, breathing without effort, moving when directed, existing within the same physical space. And yet, there was an absence that could not be mistaken for anything familiar, something that separated this state from any other condition known within the wizarding world. At first glance, the change might not have appeared immediate. There were no visible injuries, no marks upon the body, no signs of physical damage that would explain what had occurred. The individual remained present, seated or standing as they had been, their form unchanged. But within that stillness, something essential was no longer there, and its absence shaped everything that followed. Those who observed such individuals often spoke of a difference in presence. Where once there had been awareness, there was now a kind of quiet vacancy. The eyes, which had once reflected thought and recognition, seemed fixed, not in a particular direction, but without clear focus. They did not follow movement in a meaningful way, nor did they respond to changes in the environment with any sign of understanding. Movement, when it occurred, was limited and without clear intention. A person might shift slightly, adjust their posture, or respond to external guidance, but these actions lacked the subtle variation that accompanies conscious decision. There was no hesitation, no consideration, no sense of choice within them. They were simply actions, carried out without the inner process that usually gives them direction. Speech, if it was attempted, did not carry meaning. words require more than sound. They require connection between thought and expression, and in this state, that connection no longer existed. Any sound that emerged was without structure, without purpose, a reflection of the body's ability to produce noise rather than the mind's ability to form language. What defined this condition most clearly was not what could be seen, but what could no longer be found. There was no indication of memory, no sign that the past remained accessible in any meaningful way. Even the repeated memories that had once shaped the experience of Azkaban were no longer present. The cycle had ended, not because it had been resolved, but because the part of the mind that could hold it had been removed. Emotion, too, was absent, not diminished, not quiet, but entirely gone. There was no sadness, no fear, no relief, no awareness of change. The range of feeling that had once defined the inner life of the person no longer existed. What remained was a state beyond emotion, where nothing could be experienced in the way it once had been. In this way, the result of the kiss was not simply the removal of suffering, it was the removal of everything that made suffering possible, and with it, everything that made experience meaningful. It left behind a form of existence that could not be easily described, because it did not align with any known state of being. For those within the wizarding world, this outcome was often regarded with a particular kind of unease. Death, though difficult, carried with it a sense of completion, a recognition that something had ended. The state left behind by the kiss did not offer that same clarity. It continued, but without the elements that gave life its meaning, creating a condition that felt unresolved, suspended between presence and absence. Because of this, the use of the kiss was limited, not only by law, but by the understanding of what it represented. It was not simply a punishment, but a transformation into something that could not be reversed. There was no known method to restore what had been taken, no spell or process that could return the individual to their previous state. The change was final in a way that extended beyond physical boundaries. Within Azkaban, those who remained after such an event were often separated from others, not because they posed a threat, but because their condition stood apart from the rest of the prison population. They did not react, did not engage, did not participate in the quiet patterns that defined the lives of others. They existed within the same space, but not within the same experience. For other prisoners, the presence of such individuals could carry a quiet significance. It was a reminder of what lay beyond the gradual changes they were already enduring, a point at which the process would no longer continue. Even in a place where emotion had been diminished, this awareness could settle into the mind, not as fear in the usual sense, but as a recognition of finality. Over time, the condition of those affected did not change. There was no improvement, no decline, no variation. The state remained constant, unaltered by the passage of time. The body continued, but without development or response, maintaining the same quiet stillness from one moment to the next. This permanence distinguished it from all other effects of the Dementors. Where their usual influence shaped and reshaped the mind over time, this act brought that process to an end. There was no further movement, no further change, only the continuation of what remained. And so, within the walls of Azkaban, the result of the Dementor's kiss stood as something separate from the rest of the prison's quiet suffering. Not louder, not more visible, but defined by its completeness, by the absence it created, and by the understanding that what had been taken could never be returned. Not all who entered Azkaban experienced its effects in exactly the same way. While the presence of the Dementors shaped the environment for everyone, the manner in which each person responded to that influence varied, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in more noticeable forms. These differences were not always visible at first, but over time, patterns began to emerge, shaped by the nature of the individual as much as by the conditions around them. At the beginning of confinement, most prisoners shared a similar response. There was confusion, followed by the gradual recognition of what the presence of the Dementors meant. The cold, the silence, the fading of warmth, These affected everyone who came within their reach. But as days passed and the influence deepened, the internal experience began to diverge. Some individuals appeared more vulnerable from the outset. Those whose sense of self relied heavily on external connection, on relationships, on shared experience, often found the isolation particularly difficult to endure. Without voices to answer, without faces to recognize, the absence of these connections created a sense of loss that extended beyond memory. The environment removed not only the presence of others, but also the ability to maintain the feeling of belonging that once came from them. For these individuals, the fading of positive memory carried additional weight. Moments that had once been tied to connection, to shared experience, lost their emotional strength more quickly. As those memories weakened, so too did the sense of identity that had been built upon them. The process did not happen suddenly, but it moved steadily, guided by the same quiet influence that shaped everything within Azkaban. Others, whose sense of self was more internally structured, sometimes experienced the process differently. They might have relied less on external affirmation, holding a stronger sense of identity independent of their surroundings. For a time, this internal structure could offer a degree of resistance, allowing them to maintain clarity longer than others. Their thoughts might remain more organized, their awareness more stable in the early stages. But even in these cases, the influence of the Dementors did not remain without effect. The gradual removal of positive feeling, combined with the repetition of negative memory, worked upon the mind in ways that were difficult to fully resist. While the process might move more slowly, it continued, shaping thought and feeling until the differences between individuals began to narrow. Emotional resilience also played a role. Those who had faced hardship before entering Azkaban, who had developed ways of managing fear or loss, sometimes found themselves better prepared to endure the early stages. They recognized the patterns of thought, the return of difficult memory, and for a time, could maintain a degree of separation from it. This did not prevent the influence of the Dementors, but it could alter the pace at which its effects became overwhelming. At the same time, these same individuals often carried deeper or more complex memories, which, once brought forward, could have a stronger impact. The very experiences that had built their resilience could also provide the material for the Dementors' influence, creating a different kind of challenge, one that unfolded over longer periods. Age, too, appeared to affect the experience. Younger prisoners, whose identities were still forming, sometimes found the loss of structure more disorienting. Without a long history of memory to draw from, the process of fading and repetition could leave them with fewer points of reference, making the change feel more immediate. Older prisoners, with a broader range of experience, might retain fragments of identity longer, though these fragments were still subject to the same gradual weakening. The nature of a person's thoughts before imprisonment also mattered. Those who entered Azkaban with a strong sense of purpose, whether grounded in belief, ambition, or conviction, sometimes held on to that purpose as a point of focus. It could provide a kind of stability, a single thread that remained when other elements began to fade. But even this was not immune to the conditions of the prison. Over time, the ability to sustain that focus required more effort than could easily be maintained. For many, the most significant factor was not strength or weakness in the usual sense, but the ability to adapt. The mind, when faced with an environment that did not change, sought ways to continue functioning within it. Some adapted by narrowing their thoughts, focusing on simple, repetitive patterns that required less energy. Others withdrew further into themselves, reducing engagement with both memory and present experience. These adaptations were not conscious strategies, but natural responses to prolonged exposure. They allowed individuals to continue, but often at the cost of complexity. The broader range of thought and feeling that defined a person's identity became less accessible, replaced by simpler, more stable patterns that required less effort to maintain. Over time, these differences between individuals became less distinct. The environment of Azkaban did not encourage variation. It did not provide opportunities for change or growth. Instead, it shaped all who remained within it toward a similar condition, one defined by reduced feeling, limited thought, and a steady, unchanging state of existence. And yet, even within this convergence, traces of individuality could still be found. Small differences in posture, in the way a person moved or remained still, in the brief moments when a thought surfaced with greater clarity. These were subtle, often unnoticed, but they remained as quiet indications that the process, while powerful, was not entirely uniform. In this way, the experience of Azkaban revealed something about the nature of the mind itself. It showed how identity could be shaped by environment, how resilience could alter the pace of change, and how, even under the same conditions, the path taken by each individual could differ, if only for a time. But as the influence of the Dementors continued, and as the conditions of the prison remained unchanged, these differences gradually faded, leaving behind a quieter, more uniform state, where the distinctions that once separated one person from another became increasingly difficult to see. There were, on rare occasions, individuals who did not follow the same steady path toward decline as others within Azkaban. Their presence did not alter the nature of the prison, nor did it weaken the influence of the Dementors, but it revealed something important about the limits of that influence. These cases were uncommon and often depended on conditions that were not easily repeated, but they stood as quiet examples of resistance within a place where resistance was rarely seen. One such individual was Sirius Black. His time within Azkaban became notable not because he escaped the presence of the Dementors, but because he endured it in a way that differed from most. From the outside, his condition appeared much like that of others. He remained within his cell, exposed to the same cold, the same silence, and the same steady influence, and yet, something within him remained intact. The key to this difference lay not in strength alone, but in the nature of his thoughts. Sirius held on to a single idea with a clarity that did not waver. He knew, with certainty, that he had not committed the crime for which he had been imprisoned. This knowledge was not a source of comfort, but it provided something else, a fixed point that could not be easily altered or diminished. Because this thought did not carry happiness, it did not attract the same attention from the Dementors. Their influence, drawn to positive emotion, found little to take from it. It remained steady, unaffected by the gradual removal of warmth that shaped other memories. This alone would not have been enough to resist the full effect of Azkaban. The repetition of negative memory, the loss of identity, the narrowing of thought, these continued as they did for others. But Sirius possessed another quality that altered his experience, the ability to change form. As an animagus, he could transform into a large black dog, a form that existed partly outside the range of human emotional experience. In this shape, his thoughts were simpler, less structured, and less connected to the memories that the Dementors sought to draw forward. The emotional complexity that defined his human mind was reduced, and with it, the intensity of the Dementors' influence. This transformation did not remove the effects entirely. The cold remained, the silence remained, and the presence of the Dementors continued to shape the environment. But the impact on his mind was lessened, allowing him moments of clarity that others could not maintain. In these moments, he could observe his condition, understand it, and make decisions that required a level of awareness not often found within the prison. Over time, these small differences became significant. While other prisoners lost the ability to plan, to focus, or to hold on to a sense of purpose, Sirius retained just enough of these abilities to consider the possibility of escape. The thought did not come all at once, nor was it formed easily. It developed slowly, shaped by the fragments of clarity he could maintain. Even then, the process required patience. The physical condition of his body had weakened, and the environment offered little support for movement. But the presence of a stable thought, combined with the ability to shift his form, created a path that did not exist for others. It was narrow, uncertain, and difficult to follow, but it remained possible. His eventual escape was not the result of sudden strength, but of persistence. It depended on timing, on careful observation, and on the continued ability to return to that single, unchanging idea. Without these elements, the attempt would not have been possible, and even with them, it remained an exception rather than a rule. What this case revealed was not a weakness in the Dementors themselves, but a boundary to their influence. They shaped thought and feeling through the removal of positive emotion and the repetition of negative memory. But when a thought existed outside of these patterns, when it did not carry the qualities they were drawn to, it could remain in place, offering a form of resistance. This resistance was not complete. Sirius did not emerge from Azkaban unchanged. The years within the prison left their mark, shaping his behavior, his responses, and his sense of the world. The isolation, the repetition, the narrowing of experience, these effects remained present even after his escape, but the fact that he retained enough of himself to leave demonstrated that the process, while powerful, was not absolute. Other examples of resistance were far less defined, often limited to brief moments of clarity or small acts of persistence. A prisoner might hold on to a single memory longer than expected, or maintain a thought through several repetitions before it faded. These instances did not lead to escape, but they indicated that the mind, even under constant pressure, could retain fragments of its original structure. In each of these cases, the common element was not strength in the usual sense, but the presence of something that could not be easily altered. A thought, a belief, a form of existence that did not align with the patterns the Dementors influenced. These elements provided a point of stability, however small, within a system designed to remove it. Within Azkaban, such moments were rare and often unnoticed. The overall condition of the prison remained unchanged, and the influence of the Dementors continued to shape the experience of most who entered. But these exceptions, quiet and limited as they were, revealed that even within a place defined by absence, there could remain something that endured. And it was in that endurance, however fragile, that the possibility of resistance existed. Not as a force that could overcome the environment, but as a reminder that the process, while steady and complete for many, did not erase every part of what it touched. There was, within the wizarding world, a single form of magic known to stand against the influence of the Dementors. It was not a barrier in the physical sense, nor a force that pushed them away through strength alone. Instead, it worked by creating something they could not endure, something that existed in direct opposition to their nature. This magic was known as the Patronus charm, and its presence within Azkaban, though rare, revealed much about both the Dementors and the nature of resistance itself. The Patronus did not arise easily. It required more than knowledge or skill. It demanded a very specific kind of focus, one that depended on the ability to recall and sustain a deeply positive memory. Not simply a pleasant thought, but a moment filled with genuine warmth, clarity, and emotional strength. The memory had to be held in the mind with precision, its feeling brought forward fully, without distraction or doubt. In ordinary circumstances, this was already a difficult task. Within Azkaban, it became something far more complex. The environment itself worked against the conditions needed to produce such a memory. The presence of the Dementors, drawing away happiness and leaving behind a narrower range of feeling, made it increasingly difficult to access the kind of emotion required. The mind, shaped by repetition of negative memory and the fading of positive connection, struggled to reach what the charm depended upon. For this reason, most prisoners were unable to produce a Patronus at all. Even if they had once been capable of the spell, the conditions within the prison removed the foundation necessary to perform it. Without a strong and present positive memory, the charm could not take form. Attempts to cast it would fail, not because of a lack of magical ability, but because the emotional core of the spell was no longer accessible. When the Patronus did appear, however, its effect was immediate. It manifested as a form of light, often taking the shape of an animal, though its true nature extended beyond physical appearance. It carried with it a presence that contrasted sharply with the environment of Azkaban. Where the Dementors brought cold, the Patronus introduced warmth. Where they dimmed light, it created brightness. Where they drew away positive feeling, it restored it, if only for a brief moment. The Dementors did not resist this presence. They withdrew from it, not out of fear in the usual sense, but because it represented something they could not consume. The positive energy contained within the Patronus was not accessible to them. It could not be taken, altered, or diminished in the same way as ordinary emotion. As a result, they moved away, leaving the immediate area free from their influence. This effect was temporary. The Patronus required continuous focus to maintain, and within Azkaban, that focus was difficult to sustain. The environment, shaped by the Dementors, worked to weaken the very memory that powered the charm. Over time, the effort required to keep it present became greater than most could manage, and the light it created would fade, allowing the influence of the Dementors to return. Because of this, the Patronus was not a permanent solution within the prison. It could create moments of relief, brief interruptions in the steady condition that defined Azkaban, but it could not alter the overall structure of the environment. The Dementors remained, and their influence resumed as soon as the charm ended. Even so, the existence of the Patronus carried significance. It demonstrated that the effect of the Dementors, while powerful, was not absolute. There remained a form of magic that could counter it, even if only for a short time. This knowledge, though difficult to act upon, added a layer of understanding to the experience of those who were aware of it. For those who had learned the charm before entering Azkaban, the memory of its existence could serve as a point of focus, even if they could no longer produce it. The idea that such a counterforce existed, that something within them had once been capable of creating light in the presence of darkness, remained as a distant thought. It did not restore what had been lost, but it offered a different perspective on the nature of the Dementors' influence. Outside of Azkaban, the Patronus was used more effectively, often by trained witches and wizards who could maintain the necessary focus under controlled conditions. Within the prison, however, the combination of emotional depletion and environmental pressure made it nearly impossible for most to achieve. This contrast highlighted the extent to which the conditions of Azkaban were designed, not through intention, but through effect, to limit the ability to resist. There were a few individuals, often those with exceptional skill or unusual circumstances, who could produce a Patronus even within the presence of Dementors. Their success did not change the nature of the prison, but it stood as an example of what remained possible under specific conditions. These instances were rare and often required a level of emotional clarity that was difficult to maintain over time. The Patronus, in this context, was not simply a defensive spell. It was an expression of something that the Dementors could not reach, a reflection of positive experience that retained its form even under pressure. It required not only memory, but belief, not only recollection, but presence. In a place where these qualities were steadily diminished, its appearance became all the more significant. Within the quiet spaces of Azkaban, the Patronus remained an exception rather than a solution. It could not change the overall condition, but it revealed that the process shaping that condition had limit. It showed that, even in an environment defined by absence, there could still exist something that resisted removal, something that could not be consumed. And though most prisoners could not call upon it, the knowledge of its existence remained, a distant and fragile reminder that the influence of the Dementors, while deep and persistent, did not extend to every part of what a person could be. For most who were confined within Azkaban, the question of resistance did not arise in a clear or sustained way. It was not that they chose not to fight back, nor that they lacked awareness of their condition. Rather, the ability to act against it depended on qualities that were steadily being reduced: strength, clarity, focus, and purpose. These were not removed all at once. but diminished over time until the effort required to resist became greater than what could be maintained. At the center of this limitation was the state of the mind itself. To resist the influence of the Dementors required a form of concentration that depended on stable thought. A person would need to hold on to a clear idea, to maintain it without interruption, and to act upon it with intention. Within the environment of Azkaban, this process became increasingly difficult. Thoughts did not remain steady. They drifted, returned to the same patterns, or faded before they could be fully formed. The repetition of negative memory contributed to this instability. As the mind was drawn again and again toward the same difficult moments, it became harder to direct attention elsewhere. Even when a person attempted to focus on something different, the effort required to sustain that focus grew with each attempt. Over time, the mind adapted by reducing effort rather than increasing it, allowing the repeated patterns to continue without interruption. Alongside this, the fading of positive emotion removed a key source of motivation. In ordinary circumstances, the desire to change one's condition is often driven by the presence of something better to move toward. Hope, anticipation, and even simple preference create a sense of direction. Within Azkaban, these elements weakened. Without them, the idea of improvement lost its clarity, and the energy required to pursue it diminished. The absence of tools also played a role. Most forms of active resistance within the wizarding world depend on the use of a wand. Spells, defenses, and even simple protective charms require both the instrument and the ability to use it. Within Azkaban, prisoners were not given access to their wands. Without them, the range of possible actions was greatly reduced, leaving only the resources of the mind and body, both of which were already under strain. Physical condition further limited what could be attempted. As strength declined and movement became slower, the ability to act with speed or precision weakened. Even if a plan could be formed, carrying it out required a level of physical capability that was not easily sustained in such an environment. The cold, the lack of proper rest, and the gradual weakening of the body all contributed to this limitation. There was also the matter of awareness. Over time, the capacity to fully understand one's situation began to diminish. Not completely, but enough to affect decision-making. A person might recognize that their condition was undesirable, but the ability to analyze it, to consider alternatives, and to form a coherent plan became less reliable. Without clear awareness, action lost its direction. In addition to these factors, there was a subtle shift in the relationship between effort and outcome. Repeated attempts to hold on to thoughts, to recall positive memories, or to maintain focus often led to limited success. When effort does not produce a meaningful result, the inclination to continue that effort decreases. This was not a conscious decision, but a natural response. The mind, seeking stability, moved toward patterns that required less energy. Over time, this created a condition in which resistance was not actively rejected, but simply became less present. The idea of fighting back, of pushing against the influence of the Dementors, did not hold the same place within thought as it might have before. It appeared less often, and when it did appear, it was more difficult to sustain. This absence of resistance did not mean that prisoners accepted their condition in a deliberate way. Acceptance, in its usual sense, implies a choice. Within Azkaban, the process was more gradual. The capacity to choose diminished alongside other qualities, leaving behind a quieter state in which fewer alternatives were considered. For those observing from outside, this might have seemed like compliance, a lack of will, or a failure to act. But within the conditions of the prison, it reflected the steady effect of an environment that altered the very qualities required for action. It was not simply that prisoners did not resist, but that the ability to do so was being reshaped. There were, as in other aspects of Azkaban, rare exceptions. Individuals who retained enough clarity, enough focus, or access to a stable thought could attempt resistance in limited ways, but these cases depended on conditions that were not common, and even then, the effort required was considerable. For the majority, the experience remained consistent. The combination of mental fatigue, emotional depletion, physical weakening, and lack of resources created a state in which resistance was difficult to initiate and even harder to maintain. Each factor reinforced the others, forming a system that did not require constant enforcement because it shaped the conditions in which enforcement would have been necessary. In this way, the inability to fight back became part of the structure of Azkaban itself. It was not imposed through visible force, but developed through the steady influence of the Dementors and the environment they created. What remained was a quiet continuation, where the absence of resistance was not a sign of agreement, but the result of a process that had gradually removed the means to oppose it. The presence of Dementors within Azkaban was not an accident of nature alone, but a decision shaped by those who governed the wizarding world. The Ministry of Magic, tasked with maintaining order and security, chose to rely on these beings as the primary means of control within the prison. This decision was not made lightly, and yet, over time, it became accepted, woven into the structure of how justice was understood and enforced. From a practical perspective, the arrangement offered a form of efficiency. Dementors did not require rest, did not demand payment, and did not question their role. Their presence alone maintained the condition of the prison, reducing the need for constant supervision. The absence of escape attempts, the quiet stillness within the walls, these could be seen as signs that the system was working as intended. But beneath this appearance of order, there was a deeper reliance, one that extended beyond simple practicality. The fear associated with Azkaban, the knowledge of what awaited those who were sent there, became part of the broader system of control. It shaped behavior not only within the prison, but outside of it as well. The idea of Azkaban carried a weight that reached far beyond its physical location. To be sentenced, there was not simply to be removed from society, but to face a form of punishment that extended into the mind itself. This understanding created a deterrent, influencing decisions and actions through the anticipation of what might happen. In this way, the Ministry's use of Dementors extended its influence beyond the walls of the prison. Yet, this reliance came with questions that were not always openly addressed. The Dementors, as has been seen, did not distinguish between individuals based on the nature of their actions. They responded to emotion without consideration of guilt or innocence. Once within their presence, all prisoners were subject to the same influence, regardless of the circumstances that had led them there. This raised a quiet tension within the concept of justice. Punishment, in its usual sense, is often tied to the idea of proportion, that the consequence should reflect the nature of the action. Within Azkaban, the experience did not adjust itself in this way. The gradual removal of happiness, the repetition of painful memory, the loss of identity, these were not measured or controlled. They occurred as a result of the environment itself. For the Ministry, maintaining this system required a degree of acceptance, an acknowledgement that the method being used carried effects that extended beyond ordinary punishment. This acceptance was not always spoken of directly. Instead, it became part of the structure, a condition that was understood but not frequently examined. There were those within the wizarding world who expressed concern about this arrangement. Some questioned whether it was appropriate to rely on beings whose nature could not be fully controlled, whose influence extended into aspects of the mind that were not easily measured. Others considered the broader implications, wondering what it meant for a society to depend on fear as a primary means of maintaining order. Despite these concerns, the system remained in place for many years. The absence of visible disorder within Azkaban, the lack of escape attempts, and the general stability it appeared to provide reinforced the decision. Change, in such a context, required not only recognition of the problem, but the willingness to accept a different approach, one that might carry its own uncertainties. The relationship between the Ministry and the Dementors was therefore one of mutual function. The Ministry provided a place where the Dementors could exist and feed, while the Dementors maintained the condition of the prison. This arrangement, while effective in a narrow sense, created a dependency that was not easily altered. Removing the Dementors would require replacing them with another system, one that could maintain order without relying on the same methods. Over time, this dependency shaped the way Azkaban was perceived. It was not simply a prison, but a place defined by the presence of the Dementors. The two became inseparable in the minds of those who thought about it. To consider one was to consider the other, and to question the system was to question both. Within this structure, the experience of the prisoners became secondary to the function of the prison itself. The system was designed to contain, to deter, and to maintain order. The individual experience, while known, was not always the primary focus. It existed within the system, shaped by it, but not always influencing how the system was understood or maintained. This separation between function and experience created a distance that allowed the system to continue. As long as Azkaban fulfilled its role in maintaining order, the details of what occurred within its walls could remain less examined. The quiet nature of the suffering within the prison, the absence of visible disturbance, contributed to this distance, making it easier to accept the arrangement as it was. And so, the Ministry's dependence on the Dementors became part of the broader structure of the wizarding world, a decision that shaped not only the experience of those within Azkaban, but also the way justice, control, and consequence were understood beyond it. Within the wider structure of the wizarding world, Azkaban was often presented as a place of justice, a necessary response to wrongdoing, a final measure taken when other options were no longer sufficient. It existed as a symbol as much as a location, representing order maintained and danger contained. And yet, when considered more closely, the nature of that justice became less certain, shaped by conditions that did not always align with the ideas it was meant to uphold. Punishment, in its usual form, carries with it a sense of proportion and intention. It is designed not only to respond to an action, but to reflect it, to create a balance between what has been done and what follows. Within Azkaban, this balance was difficult to maintain. The experience of imprisonment did not adjust itself according to the nature of the offense. It did not measure its effect or change its intensity. It remained constant, shaped not by judgment, but by the presence of the Dementors. This created a condition in which all prisoners, regardless of their circumstances, were subject to the same gradual transformation. The loss of happiness, the repetition of painful memory, the erosion of identity, these were not applied with variation or restraint. They occurred as a result of the environment itself, affecting each individual in ways that could not be easily controlled or limited. For some, this raised questions about the purpose of the prison. If the goal was to contain, then the system achieved that with quiet efficiency. If the goal was to punish, then the nature of that punishment extended beyond what might be expected. It did not simply restrict freedom or impose hardship. It altered the inner experience of those confined, reshaping thought and feeling in ways that continued over time. There was also the question of change. In many systems, punishment carries with it the possibility of reflection, of learning, or of eventual return. Within Azkaban, such possibilities were difficult to sustain. Without clarity, without emotional balance, the ability to reconsider past actions or to form new understanding became limited. This absence did not always appear immediately. In the early stages, a prisoner might still hold on to thoughts of the outside world and might still consider what had led them there. But as the influence of the Dementors continued, these thoughts became harder to maintain. The focus shifted inward, toward memory, toward repetition, toward the narrowing of experience. In this state, the idea of growth or change became distant. The concept of fairness also became more difficult to define. Justice, when it is considered carefully, often depends on the ability to distinguish between different actions, different intentions, and different outcomes. Within Azkaban, such distinctions did not affect the experience of imprisonment. The same environment, the same influence, the same gradual transformation applied to all. This raised the possibility that the system, while effective in maintaining order, did not fully align with the principles it was meant to represent. It functioned, but its function came at a cost that extended beyond physical confinement. It reached into areas of the mind that were not easily measured or restored, creating effects that continued regardless of the original reason for imprisonment. For those within the ministry who considered these questions, the issue was not simple. Removing or altering the system would require finding another method to achieve the same level of control and containment. Any alternative would carry its own uncertainties, its own limitations. In this context, the existing system, for all its difficulties, remained in place, supported by its effectiveness rather than its alignment with ideal principles. Outside the ministry, opinions varied. Some accepted Azkaban as a necessary part of maintaining safety, focusing on its role rather than its method. Others viewed it with quiet unease, aware of the effects it produced, but uncertain of how those effects should be addressed. These differing perspectives did not always lead to direct conflict, but they contributed to an ongoing, often unspoken consideration of what justice should be. Within the prison itself, these broader questions held little immediate meaning. The conditions of Azkaban shaped the experience of those within it, regardless of how they were understood outside. The gradual loss of warmth, the repetition of memory, the narrowing of identity, these continued without reference to larger ideas of fairness or purpose. They were simply part of the environment, shaping each moment as it passed. And yet, the existence of these questions remained important. They suggested that the system, while stable, was not beyond examination, that the experience of those within Azkaban, though quiet and often unseen, held significance beyond the walls of the prison, that justice, when considered fully, required more than function alone. In this way, Azkaban stood as both a solution and a question. It maintained order, but it also revealed the complexity of doing so through means that reached beyond ordinary boundaries. It fulfilled its role, but it did so in a way that invited reflection on what that role should be and whether it could be achieved differently. Within the steady silence of the prison, these reflections did not alter the immediate experience. But beyond the walls, the idea of Azkaban continued to exist, shaping not only the behavior of individuals, but the understanding of justice itself in ways that were as quiet and persistent as the place it described. For many years, the presence of the Dementors within Azkaban remained stable, bound to the prison through an arrangement that, while uneasy, continued without significant change. Their role was defined, their behavior predictable within the narrow limits of their nature. They fed, they maintained the condition of the prison, and in doing so, they supported the structure upon which the ministry relied. But this balance, quiet and persistent as it was, depended on a larger stability within the wizarding world, one that did not remain unchanged. As the influence of Lord Voldemort began to return, first in uncertain signs and then with growing clarity, the conditions that held the Dementors in place began to shift. These beings, as had always been understood, were not bound by loyalty in the way witches and wizards might be. They did not serve out of belief or obligation. They remained where they were because the environment suited them, because it provided what they needed, and because the arrangement allowed them to exist without interference. Voldemort's rise altered that balance. Where the ministry had offered a controlled environment, defined by structure and limitation, Voldemort offered something different. He did not seek to regulate the Dementors or contain their influence. Instead, he allowed them freedom to act according to their nature, to move beyond the boundaries of Azkaban, and to feed without restriction. This change, subtle at first, carried significant consequences. The Dementors responded not to command, but to opportunity. In Voldemort's growing presence, they found conditions that aligned more closely with their nature. The fear, the instability, the spreading uncertainty within the wizarding world created an environment rich with the emotion they consumed. It was not a matter of choosing sides in a conflict, but of moving toward a place where their existence could expand. As this shift took place, the role of Azkaban began to weaken. The prison, once defined by the constant presence of the Dementors, found itself altered as those beings gradually withdrew. Their absence did not occur all at once, but in stages, each one reducing the influence that had once defined the experience within its walls. The cold remained, the structure remained, but the central force that shaped the prison began to fade. For the Ministry, this change presented a challenge that had not been fully anticipated. The system they had relied upon was no longer stable. The very beings that had maintained control were now acting beyond it, moving in ways that could not be easily predicted or contained. The dependence that had once seemed efficient now revealed its limits, as the Ministry found itself without a reliable means of maintaining the same level of order. Within Azkaban, the effects of this shift were complex. For those still imprisoned, the gradual absence of the Dementors altered the environment in ways that were both subtle and significant. The constant pressure that had shaped thought and feeling began to lessen. The cold, though still present, no longer carried the same depth. The silence, while unchanged, felt different without the underlying influence that had once defined it. This change did not immediately restore what had been lost. The effects of prolonged exposure to the Dementors did not reverse simply because their presence diminished. The loss of memory, the narrowing of identity, the physical weakening, these remained. But the ongoing process that had sustained those changes was no longer as strong, allowing for a different kind of experience to emerge. For some prisoners, this created a sense of clarity that had been absent for a long time. Thoughts that had once been difficult to hold began to return, though often in fragmented form. The ability to reflect, to consider the present as distinct from the past, became more possible. This did not erase the years of confinement, but it altered the way those years were experienced moving forward. At the same time, the removal of the Dementors introduced new uncertainties. Without their presence, the structure of the prison required change. Guards, routines, and systems that had not been necessary before now needed to be established. The transition was not immediate, and in the absence of a fully formed alternative, Azkaban entered a period of adjustment. Beyond the prison, the movement of the Dementors into the wider world carried its own consequences. No longer confined to a single location, their influence spread into areas that had not previously been affected. The same cold, the same quiet removal of warmth and clarity, now appeared in places where it had not been known before. This expansion reflected the broader instability of the time, as the boundaries that once contained certain forces began to dissolve. In this context, the relationship between the Ministry and the Dementors was revealed to be more fragile than it had appeared. What had once been seen as a stable arrangement was shown to depend on conditions that could change. The reliance on beings whose nature could not be controlled carried risks that became visible only when those conditions shifted. The departure of the Dementors from Azkaban did not mark a simple end to their influence. Instead, it represented a transformation, a movement from a contained system into a broader and less predictable presence. The prison, once defined by them, began to change in their absence, while the world beyond its walls began to feel their effects more directly. And so, the quiet balance that had once sustained Azkaban gave way to a different reality, one shaped not by steady control, but by change and uncertainty. The Dementors, no longer confined, continued to exist as they always had, drawn to emotion, moving where conditions allowed, and leaving behind the same gradual effects that had once been contained within the walls of the prison. When the Dementors moved beyond the boundaries of Azkaban, Their presence did not change in nature, but it changed in reach. What had once been confined to a distant island, felt only by those sent there, now extended into the wider world. The same quiet influence that had shaped the prison began to appear in places that had never known it before, altering the atmosphere in ways that were difficult to immediately understand. At first, the signs were subtle, a sudden drop in temperature that could not be explained by weather alone, a dimming of light that seemed to pass quickly, leaving behind only a sense that something had shifted. People spoke of moments when the air felt heavier, when sound seemed distant, when a quiet unease settled without clear cause. These experiences did not always lead to immediate recognition, but they carried the same qualities that had long defined the presence of the Dementors. As their movement continued, these signs became more frequent, more noticeable, and more difficult to dismiss. The influence that had once been concentrated within Azkaban now appeared in different locations. Often without warning, it did not remain in one place for long, but moved in a way that reflected its nature, drawn toward areas where emotion was strong, where fear and uncertainty created conditions that aligned with what the Dementors sought. For those who encountered them outside the prison, the experience was unfamiliar in a different way. Unlike prisoners, who were already within an environment shaped by the Dementors, these individuals experienced the change against the contrast of ordinary life. The sudden absence of warmth, the fading of positive feeling, and the emergence of difficult memories stood out more sharply because they interrupted a state that had not yet been altered. This contrast made the presence of the Dementors more immediately noticeable, but not necessarily easier to resist. The same processes occurred: the gradual removal of happiness, the repetition of memory, the narrowing of thought. The difference lay in the fact that these changes were now happening in places that had not been designed to contain them, affecting people who had not been prepared for such conditions. Communities began to feel these effects in quiet ways. Conversations grew more subdued, not because of visible cause, but because the energy that supported them had diminished. Places that once felt familiar took on a different quality, less defined, less stable. Even those who had never encountered a Dementor directly could sense that something had changed, though they might not have had the words to describe it. In some cases, the presence of the Dementors was more direct. Individuals who came within close range experienced the same sensations that had long been associated with Azkaban: the cold that settled into the body, the heaviness of thought, the sudden return of painful memory. These moments, though often brief, carried a depth that left a lasting impression, shaping how those individuals understood what they had encountered. The spread of this influence created a broader sense of uncertainty. They had become part of the wider environment, appearing without clear pattern, affecting individuals and places in ways that could not be easily predicted. For those responsible for maintaining order, this shift presented new challenges. The methods used to manage the Dementors within Azkaban did not apply in the same way outside of it. There were fewer boundaries, fewer controls, and a wider range of conditions to consider. The presence of the Dementors, once stable and predictable within the prison, became more variable, requiring new responses that were not always immediately available. At the same time, the nature of the Dementors themselves remained unchanged. They did not seek to disrupt or create conflict in the way other forces might. They moved according to their nature, drawn to emotion, responding to conditions that allowed them to feed. The changes they brought were not deliberate acts, but natural consequences of their presence. This distinction made their influence both subtle and far-reaching. Instead, it unfolded quietly, altering the experience of those it touched in ways that were often internal rather than external. The absence of clear signs made it more difficult to identify, and therefore more difficult to address. Over time, the spread of the Dementors beyond Azkaban became part of the broader condition of the wizarding world during this period. It reflected the instability that had begun to take hold, the weakening of structures that had once provided containment. The prison, once a single point of influence, was no longer the sole location where these effects could be found. And so, the experience that had once been limited to those within Azkaban extended outward, becoming something that could be encountered by many, though not always understood. The same quiet processes continued, the same gradual changes, now present in a wider range of places, shaping the world in ways that were as subtle as they were significant. What the Dementors did could not be fully understood by looking only at the surface of their presence. Their true influence was psychological, not in the sense of direct force, but in the way they reshaped how the mind experienced itself. They did not introduce fear in the way a sudden danger might. Instead, they revealed what was already there, bringing it forward and allowing it to take hold without resistance. Fear, in its ordinary form, often comes from the unknown or from the anticipation of harm. It has movement within it, a sense of urgency, a desire to act or escape. The presence of the Dementors did not rely on this kind of fear. What they brought was closer to despair, a state that did not push outward, but settled inward, quiet and persistent. It did not demand action. It reduced the desire to act at all. This distinction was important. Fear can be resisted, managed, or redirected. It allows for response, for decision, for change. Despair, by contrast, narrows the range of possible thought. It removes the sense that change is possible, replacing it with a steady awareness that things will remain as they are. In this state, the mind does not reach outward, it turns inward, focusing on what cannot be altered. The Dementors created conditions in which this shift could occur. By removing positive emotion and allowing negative memory to repeat, they changed the balance within the mind. Without variation, without the presence of contrasting feeling, despair became the dominant state. It did not arrive suddenly, it developed gradually, shaped by the environment and reinforced by repetition. In this way, the power of the Dementors was not in what they added, but in what they allowed to surface. The mind, when left without support, often returns to its most difficult points. These points, once brought forward, can shape perception, influencing how all other experiences are understood. The Dementors did not need to create new suffering. They made existing suffering more present, more immediate, and more difficult to move away from. This process affected not only memory, but interpretation. Events from the past, once held with complexity, could begin to appear in simpler, more fixed forms. A mistake might become a defining feature. A loss might become a permanent condition. Without the presence of other emotions to provide balance, these interpretations could settle into place, shaping the way the mind understood itself and its surroundings. Over time, this narrowing of interpretation extended into the present. The absence of positive emotion did not simply remove joy, it altered perception, making it more difficult to recognize or create meaning within new experiences. The world, as it was perceived, became quieter, flatter, and less varied. This change in perception reinforced the state of despair. Without moments of contrast, without shifts in feeling, the mind found little to interrupt the ongoing pattern. Each moment felt similar to the last. Each thought connected to the same underlying condition. The absence of change became part of the experience itself, making it harder to imagine that change could occur. It is also important to consider that this process did not always feel intense. Despair, as shaped by the Dementors, was not always overwhelming. It often existed as a steady background, a constant presence that did not draw attention to itself in dramatic ways. This made it more difficult to recognize as a separate condition. It did not stand out, it simply remained. In this state, the difference between feeling and absence of feeling became less clear. A person might be aware that something was missing, but unable to define it. The lack of variation made it harder to identify what had changed. Over time, this condition could begin to feel normal, not because it was understood, but because it was constant. This normalization further reduced the possibility of resistance. When a state remains unchanged for long enough, the mind adjusts to it. It becomes the baseline against which all other experiences are measured. Without a reference point, without memory of a different condition that can be clearly accessed, the current state is no longer seen as a change, but as the way things are. The Dementors, through their presence, created and maintained this environment. They did not need to act continuously because the conditions they established continued on their own. The mind, once shaped in this way, required little additional influence to remain within that pattern, and so their power was not in direct action, but in the creation of a state where the mind's own processes worked in alignment with their nature. They revealed what was difficult, allowed it to remain, and removed what might have balanced it. The result was a condition that did not rely on force, but on persistence, unfolding quietly and steadily within those who came within their reach. When considering the nature of the Dementors, it becomes possible to view them not only as beings within a fictional world, but also as reflections of something more familiar. Their influence, though described through magic, follows patterns that can be recognized beyond the boundaries of that world. The gradual loss of warmth, the narrowing of thought, the quiet persistence of despair. These are experiences that, while shaped here by supernatural means, echo conditions that exist in other forms. The author of this world, J.K. Rowling, once described the Dementors as a representation of depression. This description does not change their role within the story, but it offers a way to understand their effect in a more grounded sense. Depression, like the influence of the Dementors, is not always loud or sudden. It often arrives gradually, altering the way a person experiences their thoughts, their memories, and the world around them. One of the most striking similarities lies in the way positive feeling becomes distant. In both cases, memories that once carried warmth remain present, but the emotion attached to them fades. A person can recall a moment of happiness without being able to feel it, creating a separation between memory and experience. This separation, subtle at first, grows over time, shaping how the mind understands itself. There is also a parallel in the repetition of difficult thought. Just as the Dementors draw forward painful memories, depression often brings attention back to moments of regret, loss, or fear. These thoughts can appear without invitation, repeating themselves in ways that feel difficult to control. The more they repeat, the more present they become, shaping the overall pattern of thought. Another similarity can be found in the loss of variation. In ordinary experience, thoughts and feelings move through a range, creating contrast that gives meaning to each moment. Within both the influence of the Dementors and the experience of depression, this range becomes narrower. The mind settles into a more consistent state, where change is limited and the sense of movement is reduced. The physical effects described within Azkaban also find a reflection here. The heaviness of the body, the lack of energy, the difficulty in carrying out even simple actions, these are not unique to the presence of Dementors. They mirror the way in which emotional states can influence physical experience, shaping how the body responds to the world. Time, too, is affected in similar ways. The blending of moments, the difficulty in distinguishing one day from the next, the sense that time is passing without clear structure. These experiences appear both within Azkaban and in real conditions that affect the mind. Without variation, without meaningful markers, time loses its usual form, becoming something that is experienced rather than measured. The absence of motivation is another point of connection. When positive feeling is reduced, the drive to act often diminishes. Tasks that once seemed simple can feel distant or unnecessary. The effort required to begin or continue an action increases, not because the action itself has changed, but because the internal conditions that support it have weakened. It is important to recognize that these parallels do not make the two experiences identical. The influence of the Dementors is shaped by a fictional framework with clear external causes and defined effects. Real human experience is more complex, influenced by a wide range of factors that extend beyond any single explanation. And yet, the comparison provides a way to understand the emotional depth of what is being described. Within the story, the presence of the Dementors serves a narrative purpose, illustrating the impact of despair in a form that can be observed and understood. By giving this experience a shape, a presence, and a set of behaviors, it becomes possible to explore its effects in a more tangible way. The abstract becomes visible, and the internal becomes external. This connection also explains the significance of resistance within the story. The use of the Patronus charm, which requires a strong positive memory, reflects the idea that even in the presence of despair, there remains the possibility of drawing upon something different. It does not remove the condition entirely, but it creates a moment of contrast, a reminder that other states exist. In this way, the Dementors can be seen as more than guardians of a prison. They represent a condition that extends beyond the walls of Azkaban, one that affects the mind in ways that are both subtle and profound. Their presence, while fictional, is grounded in patterns that are widely recognized, making their influence both specific to the story and broadly understandable. And so, the quiet experience of Azkaban, shaped by these beings, reflects not only a part of the wizarding world, but also an aspect of human experience, translated into a form that can be observed from a distance, yet still felt with a sense of familiarity. Within Azkaban, light existed, but it did not behave in the way it did elsewhere. It entered the prison in small and uncertain ways, slipping through narrow windows or resting faintly along the edges of stone, but it never seemed to settle fully. It lacked strength, as though it could not remain in one place for long, and what it revealed was always limited. Corners stayed dim, shapes softened, and the space between objects felt wider than it should have been. This absence was not complete darkness. It was something quieter, a steady reduction of brightness that made everything feel less defined. Colors, when they appeared, were muted, carrying less depth than before. Surfaces lost their contrast, blending into one another in ways that made it difficult to hold onto detail. The world did not disappear, but it became less clear, less certain. The presence of the Dementors shaped this condition. Where they moved, light seemed to recede, not abruptly, but gradually, as though it were being drawn away. This change was not always noticeable at first. A prisoner might sense that the space had grown dimmer without being able to say when it had happened. Light did not remain constant. It faded in response to something that could not be seen directly. This fading of light carried more than a visual effect. It influenced how the space was experienced, how distance was perceived, how movement was understood. Without strong light, depth became harder to judge. The boundaries of a room felt less defined, and the connection between one place and another became less certain. Even within a confined space, this created a sense of quiet disorientation. Alongside this, there was the absence of warmth that often accompanies light. In most environments, the two are linked, the presence of one suggesting the presence of the other. Within Azkaban, this connection was broken. Light, when it appeared, did not bring warmth with it. It existed alone, faint and limited, offering visibility without comfort. This separation contributed to the overall atmosphere of the prison. It reinforced the sense that something essential was missing, not in a way that could be easily measured, but in a way that could be felt. The world remained visible, but not inviting. It could be seen, but not experienced in the same way as before. Over time, the mind began to respond to this condition. Just as the absence of positive emotion altered thought, the absence of strong light altered perception. Without variation in brightness, without clear transitions between light and shadow, the visual experience became more uniform. This uniformity reduced stimulation, making it easier for the mind to settle into the same narrow patterns that defined other aspects of life within Azkaban. In this way, light became more than a physical element. It took on a symbolic role, representing the presence of clarity, of warmth, of possibility. Its absence, then, reflected the removal of these qualities. Where light was reduced, clarity followed. Where it faded, so too did the sense of direction and meaning that often comes with it. This symbolism was not always recognized directly by those within the prison. The changes in light were experienced rather than analyzed, but their effect was present nonetheless, shaping how the environment was understood and how the mind responded to it. The dimness of the space became part of the overall condition, reinforcing the steady absence that defined so much of life within Azkaban. There were moments when light appeared more clearly, when the sky shifted enough to allow a brief increase in brightness. These moments stood out, not because they changed the environment in a lasting way, but because they provided contrast. For a short time, the space felt different. Edges became sharper, colors more distinct, and the sense of distance more defined. Yet these moments were brief. The conditions that shaped Azkaban did not allow for lasting change. The brightness would fade again, returning the space to its usual state. The contrast, once gone, left behind a deeper awareness of what was missing, reinforcing the overall pattern rather than breaking it. For those within the prison, the absence of light became part of the background of existence. It did not require attention. It did not demand response. It simply remained, shaping each moment in a quiet and consistent way. Over time, it became difficult to imagine the space as anything else. And so, within Azkaban, light was not removed entirely, but diminished to a point where its presence no longer carried the same meaning. It existed, but without strength, without warmth, without the qualities that might have provided balance. In its place, there remained a steady dimness, one that reflected the broader condition of the prison, where clarity, like warmth and hope, had been quietly drawn away. Within the steady quiet of Azkaban, where most thoughts were drawn into repetition and much of what once defined a person began to fade, there remained a small and often fragile possibility. It did not appear clearly, nor did it remain easily. But for some, there existed the ability to hold on to a single memory, a single idea, in a way that allowed it to stand apart from the rest. This memory did not need to be large or extraordinary. It could be simple, a moment that carried meaning beyond its size. What mattered was not its scale, but its stability. In an environment where most thoughts drifted or returned to the same patterns, a memory that could remain unchanged became something of quiet importance. For those who managed to hold such a memory, it served as a point of reference. While other thoughts shifted, faded, or repeated, this one remained. It provided a sense of continuity, a connection between what had been and what still existed. It did not remove the effects of the Dementors, but it created a small space within the mind where those effects were less complete. Holding on to such a memory was not a simple task. It required a level of focus that was difficult to maintain under the conditions of the prison. The presence of the Dementors worked against it, drawing attention away, weakening the emotional strength that supported the memory. Over time, even the most stable thoughts became harder to sustain. And yet, for brief periods, it was possible. A prisoner might return to a specific moment, a place, a voice, or a feeling that had once carried meaning. In doing so, they created a contrast within their experience. However small, the repetition of negative memory was interrupted, if only for a short time, by something different. This interruption did not last. The environment of Azkaban did not allow for long-term balance. The influence of the Dementors continued, and the effort required to maintain the memory increased. Eventually, the thought would weaken, slipping back into the broader pattern that shaped the mind. But the existence of these moments was significant. They showed that even within a system designed to remove variation, the mind could still produce it, however briefly. The ability to hold onto a single memory, to return to it again and again, provided a form of quiet resistance, not against the prison itself, but against the complete loss of self. In some cases, this memory became something more structured. It might take the form of a repeated thought, a simple phrase, or a clear idea that could be returned to when other thoughts became unstable. This repetition, while limited, offered a kind of rhythm within the otherwise unchanging flow of time. It created a pattern that could be recognized, something that did not depend on the external environment. The strength of such an anchor depended on its ability to remain separate from the patterns shaped by the Dementors. If it carried too much positive emotion, it risked being drawn into the same process that removed happiness. If it connected too closely to painful memory, it could become part of the repetition that defined the mind. To remain stable, it often existed in a balanced space, clear enough to hold, but not so strong that it attracted attention. This delicate balance made it difficult to sustain. Many prisoners experienced brief moments of clarity, only to find that the memory they had held could not be maintained. The effort required grew with time, and without support, it became easier to let the thought fade than to continue holding it. For a few, however, the memory remained longer. It became a quiet companion within the isolation of the prison, something that could be returned to when other thoughts became too uncertain. It did not change the conditions of Azkaban, but it altered the experience of those conditions in a subtle way. These mental anchors did not restore what had been lost. They did not bring back the full range of emotion or the clarity of thought that existed before imprisonment. But they provided a small measure of stability, a way to maintain a connection to something beyond the immediate environment. Over time, even these anchors could weaken. The continued presence of the Dementors, the absence of reinforcement, and the gradual narrowing of thought all worked against them. What had once been clear became more difficult to recall, and what had once been stable began to shift. And yet, their presence, even when temporary, revealed something about the nature of the mind. It showed that within a space defined by absence, there could still exist a point of presence, however small, that even when much had been taken, something could remain, if only for a time. In the quiet, dim spaces of Azkaban, where most things faded or repeated without change, these moments stood apart. Not as a solution, not as a means of escape, but as a quiet indication that the process, though steady and persistent, did not entirely erase the possibility of holding on to something beyond it. Over longer stretches of time, the effects of Azkaban did not always lead to the same quiet stillness described before. For some prisoners, the gradual narrowing of thought, the repetition of memory, and the loss of emotional balance created a different outcome, one that moved not toward silence, but toward instability. This change did not appear suddenly. It developed through the same steady processes, but with a different result, shaped by how the mind responded to sustained pressure. At first, the signs were subtle. Thoughts that once followed a clear path began to break apart more easily. A memory might begin in one form and shift into another, losing its original structure. The connection between one idea and the next became less certain, making it harder to maintain a steady sense of sequence. These changes could be brief at the beginning, passing without clear recognition. As the influence of the Dementors continued, these moments became more frequent. The repetition of painful memory, instead of remaining consistent, began to overlap and merge. Different moments from the past could blend together, creating experiences that were not entirely accurate, but felt immediate and difficult to separate. The mind, lacking clear boundaries between one thought and another, struggled to maintain distinction. In this state, the ability to interpret what was being experienced weakened. A prisoner might not always recognize that a thought belonged to the past. It could feel present, unfolding again without clear reference to time. This created a condition in which reality and memory were no longer clearly divided. each influencing the other in ways that made both harder to understand. Alongside this, emotional response, already reduced in range, could become uneven. Instead of the steady absence described earlier, there might be moments of sudden intensity, followed by periods of quiet. These shifts did not follow a pattern that could be predicted. They appeared without clear cause, shaped by the instability of the thoughts themselves. This combination of fragmented thought and uneven feeling created a form of mental strain that was difficult to sustain. The mind, unable to settle into a stable pattern, moved between states without clear transition. Over time, this movement could lead to a breakdown in the ability to organize experience, leaving the individual without a consistent sense of what was happening within or around them. For some prisoners, this process resulted in what could be described as madness, not in a single, defined way, but as a range of conditions where thought no longer followed recognizable patterns. Speech, if it occurred, might lack coherence. Reflecting the disordered structure of the mind, movement could become irregular, not directed by clear intention, but by impulses that were difficult to understand. This state did not always appear dramatic. In many cases, it remained quiet, contained within the individual, not expressed outwardly in ways that drew attention. The absence of interaction within Azkaban meant that such changes could go unnoticed by others, each prisoner experiencing their own condition without direct comparison. The cause of this outcome was not a single factor, but the accumulation of many. The constant presence of the Dementors, the lack of variation in the environment, the repetition of memory, the fading of identity, all contributed to a condition in which the mind could no longer maintain its usual structure. Without support, without interruption, the processes that normally keep thought organized began to weaken. It is important to note that this outcome was not universal. Many prisoners moved toward the quiet stillness described earlier, where thought and feeling became limited but stable. Others, however, followed a different path, where the same conditions led to instability rather than silence. The difference between these outcomes was not always clear, shaped by individual factors that were difficult to measure. For those who reached this state, the experience of Azkaban changed. The steady patterns that defined the prison were no longer perceived in the same way. The environment remained constant, but the ability to recognize and interpret it had shifted. What was once understood, even in a limited way, became uncertain. Over time, this instability could settle into its own form of consistency. The mind, unable to return to its previous structure, adapted to the new condition. The lack of clarity became normal, not because it was stable, but because it remained unchanged. In this way, even madness could take on a quiet persistence, becoming part of the overall experience. Within the walls of Azkaban, this outcome stood as another reflection of the prison's effect. It showed that the removal of balance within the mind did not lead to a single result. It could produce silence, or it could produce disorder, depending on how the individual responded to the same steady influence. And in both cases, the process remained the same. The Dementors did not choose the outcome. They created the conditions, and within those conditions, the mind adjusted as it could, sometimes towards stillness, and sometimes toward a state where thought itself could no longer follow its usual path. Over time, the loss of hope did not occur as a single moment, nor as a clear decision. It unfolded gradually, shaped by the same quiet processes that defined every other aspect of Azkaban. At first, hope remained in small and uncertain ways. It might appear as a thought of the outside world, a distant possibility of change, or a simple expectation that something different could still occur. These early forms of hope did not carry strong emotion, but they existed as part of the mind's natural movement toward the future. Even within the difficult conditions of the prison, the idea that time would bring change could still be held, if only faintly. A prisoner might imagine the passing of days, the end of a sentence, or the chance of something beyond the walls. But as the influence of the Dementors continued, These thoughts became harder to maintain. The fading of positive feeling reduced the emotional strength that supported them. Without that support, hope lost its clarity. It remained as an idea, but without the sense of possibility that gave it meaning. The future became something abstract, less connected to the present, and more difficult to imagine in concrete terms. At the same time, the repetition of painful memory drew attention away from what might come and toward what had already happened. The mind, occupied with the past, found less space for thoughts of the future. Each return to a difficult memory reinforced the sense that what had been could not be changed, and without a clear sense of what could change, hope began to weaken. This weakening did not happen all at once. It moved in stages, each one building upon the last. A thought of escape might appear less often. A memory of life beyond the prison might feel more distant. The idea of time, leading to something different, might lose its importance. These changes were small when taken individually, but together they formed a pattern. As this pattern developed, hope shifted from something active to something passive. It no longer guided thought or action. Instead, it remained as a faint background idea, present but without influence. A prisoner might still understand that change was possible in a general sense, but this understanding did not lead to expectation or effort. In this state, the distinction between present and future became less meaningful. Without a sense of movement towards something, the future no longer provided direction. It existed as an extension of the present, rather than as something separate. This further reduced the role of hope, as there was little difference between what was and what might be. Eventually, even this passive form of hope could fade. The mind, having adjusted to the steady conditions of the prison, no longer returned to it. The idea of change ceased to appear in thought, not because it had been rejected, but because it no longer held relevance. The environment provided no indication that change would occur, and without such indication, the mind adapted by focusing only on what remained constant. What replaced hope was not always despair in its most intense form. Instead, it was often a quiet emptiness, a state in which expectation had been removed. Without expectation, there was no anticipation, no waiting, no sense of something approaching. Time passed without direction, and each moment existed without reference to what might follow. This absence of hope had a stabilizing effect, though not in a way that brought comfort. Without the movement between expectation and disappointment, the mind settled into a steady condition. There were fewer shifts, fewer moments of change. Everything became more consistent, more predictable, but also more limited. For those within Azkaban, this state marked a point where the process of change slowed. The earlier stages, defined by loss and repetition, gave way to a condition where little remained to be altered. The removal of hope completed the narrowing of experience, leaving behind a form of existence that was steady but incomplete. And yet, even within this condition, the absence of hope did not always feel like a loss. Without contrast, it was difficult to measure what had been removed. The memory of hope, like other positive experiences, had already faded. What remained was simply the present, experienced without the influence of what might come next. In this way, the gradual erasure of hope became part of the overall structure of Azkaban. It did not stand apart from other effects, but worked alongside them, shaping the final state of the mind. The loss of warmth, the repetition of memory, the narrowing of identity, and the absence of hope combined to create a condition that required little from the individual and offered little in return. Within the quiet, unchanging space of the prison, this was how the process reached its later stages. Not through sudden transformation, but through the steady removal of what once connected the present to the future, leaving behind a state where each moment stood alone, without expectation, and without the sense that anything beyond it remained. Within the quiet understanding of Azkaban, there remained a distinction that was not always spoken of directly, but was deeply felt by those who considered the nature of what occurred there. It was the difference between death and the state created by the Dementors, a difference that, while subtle in appearance, carried significant meaning. Death, as it is commonly understood, brings an end to experience. It closes the sequence of thought and feeling, marking a point beyond which no further change occurs. Though it carries uncertainty, it also carries finality. There is a sense that something has concluded, that whatever existed has reached its limit and passed beyond it. The condition created by the Dementors did not follow this pattern. It did not end experience in the same clear way. Instead, it altered it, reducing and reshaping it until what remained no longer resembled what had come before. In the earlier stages, this alteration was gradual, affecting memory, emotion, and identity over time. But even at its most complete, it did not produce the same finality as death. This difference became most apparent when considering the result of the Dementor's kiss. The body continued, sustained by its own processes, unchanged in its physical structure. Movement, in a limited form, remained possible. The presence of life, in its simplest definition, continued. And yet, the inner experience that had once defined that life was no longer present. In this way, the condition existed between states. It was not life as it had been known, with its full range of thought and feeling, nor was it death, with its clear ending. It was something else, a continuation without the elements that gave it meaning. This made it difficult to categorize, and perhaps more difficult to accept. For those who considered this distinction, the question was not only what remained, but what had been lost. If the body continued, but the core of experience had been removed, what did that imply about the nature of the self? Was identity tied to the physical form, or to the inner processes that had been altered or removed? Within Azkaban, these questions did not always arise in clear terms. The conditions of the prison limited the capacity for reflection, and the gradual nature of change made it difficult to identify a single point at which such distinctions became relevant. But the awareness of the Dementor's kiss, and the state it produced, existed as a quiet understanding that shaped how the prison was perceived. This understanding carried a particular weight because it suggested that the process within Azkaban did not move toward a single, defined end. Instead, it moved toward a range of possible outcomes, each shaped by the same influence but differing in result. Some prisoners faded into quiet stillness, others lost the structure of thought, and in rare cases, the process reached a point where what remained no longer aligned with ordinary definitions of life. The difference between these outcomes and death lay in continuity. In death, the process of experience stops. In the state created by the Dementors, it continues, but in a reduced and altered form. This continuation, without the qualities that once defined it, created a sense of incompleteness, a condition that did not resolve into a clear end. For those outside Azkaban, this distinction often led to the belief that the Dementor's kiss was worse than death, not because it caused greater immediate suffering, but because it removed the possibility of experience while allowing existence to continue. It left behind something that could not return to its previous state and could not move beyond it. Within the broader context of the wizarding world, this raised questions about the nature of punishment and consequence. If death marked an end, then the state created by the Dementors extended beyond that end without offering resolution. It did not allow for reflection, for change, or for conclusion. It simply remained. This permanence, combined with the absence of inner life, gave the condition its particular significance. It was not defined by what could be seen, but by what could no longer be found. The absence of thought, of feeling, of identity, these were not visible in the same way as physical change, but they shaped the understanding of what the state represented. And so, within the quiet spaces of Azkaban, the distinction between death and this altered existence remained as an underlying truth. It did not need to be spoken to be understood. It existed in the awareness of what the Dementors could do, and in the recognition that the result of their final act did not bring an end, but a different kind of continuation. In that continuation, the meaning of life, as it had once been known, no longer applied. What remained was not an ending, but a presence without substance, a form without the qualities that had once given it purpose. And it was this difference, quiet and complete, that set the condition apart from death itself. For many within Azkaban, there was no single moment that marked an ending. The process did not build toward a clear conclusion, nor did it present a final event that could be easily recognized. Instead, it moved steadily, shaped by the same quiet forces that had defined every stage before it, until the difference between continuation and ending became difficult to distinguish. In the early days, the idea of an end might still have been present. A prisoner could imagine release, the passing of time, or the possibility of change. Even when these thoughts weakened, they remained as part of the mind's structure. But as the influence of the Dementors continued, and as hope faded, the concept of an ending lost its clarity. Time no longer pointed toward a future event. It simply continued. Within this condition, the lives of many prisoners followed a similar pattern. The gradual loss of warmth, the repetition of memory, the narrowing of identity, and the quiet absence of hope combined to create a state that remained largely unchanged. Days passed without distinction, and the experience of those days became more uniform. There were fewer moments of variation, fewer shifts that might have marked progression. As physical strength declined, movement became more limited. Actions that once required little effort grew slower, then less frequent. A prisoner might remain seated or still for long periods, not out of decision, but because there was little reason to move. The body, responding to the same steady conditions as the mind, adjusted to a lower level of activity. At the same time, the internal experience continued to narrow. Thoughts became fewer, less varied, and more difficult to sustain. The repetition of memory, once a dominant feature, could begin to lose its intensity, not because it had resolved, but because the capacity to engage with it had diminished. What remained was a quieter state, where even the patterns of thought that had once defined the experience began to fade. In this later stage, the distinction between awareness and absence of awareness became less clear. A person might still be conscious, still present in a basic sense, but without the range of thought and feeling that had once accompanied that presence. The mind continued, but in a reduced form, reflecting the steady removal of what had once given it depth. For some, this process continued until the body itself could no longer sustain life. This did not occur through sudden change, but through gradual decline. The weakening of the body, combined with the absence of care and the conditions of the environment, led to a quiet end. There was no dramatic moment, no visible event that marked the transition. It happened as part of the same steady progression that had defined everything before it. For others, the process did not reach this point. Instead, it settled into a state that remained constant, where both body and mind continued in a reduced form. These individuals did not move toward an ending, but remained within the condition that had been created, existing without significant change. In both cases, the absence of clear conclusion shaped the experience. There was no resolution, no moment that could be identified as the end of the process. Instead, there was a gradual fading, a movement towards stillness that did not require a final step. The difference between being present and no longer being present became less defined, shaped by the quiet persistence of the environment. Within Azkaban, this pattern was not always observed directly. The isolation of each prisoner meant that individual experiences often remained separate. There were few opportunities to witness the full course of another's condition. Each person remained within their own space, their own gradual movement through the same steady process. And yet, The overall structure of the prison reflected this pattern. It was a place where change did not come in clear stages, but in small, continuous shifts that added together over time. The absence of dramatic events, the quiet nature of the experience, and the steady influence of the Dementors all contributed to a condition where endings did not stand apart from what came before them. In this way, the quiet end of many prisoners was not a distinct event, but the final part of a long and continuous process. It did not interrupt the pattern of Azkaban. It completed it in the same quiet manner in which it had begun, leaving behind a space that remained unchanged, ready to continue in the same way for those who followed. After the war had ended and the influence of Voldemort had been removed from the wizarding world, the structure of many long-standing systems began to change. Among these was Azkaban, a place that had, for years, depended on the presence of the Dementors to define its purpose and maintain its control. With their departure and the events that had revealed the limits of relying on them, the prison could no longer continue in the same way it once had. The decision to remove the Dementors from Azkaban did not occur as a sudden shift, but as part of a broader reconsideration of how justice should be maintained. The experience of their influence, once accepted as necessary, had come to be understood more fully. The cost of that influence, not only to those imprisoned but to the stability of the system itself, could no longer be set aside without question. Without the Dementors, Azkaban changed in ways that were both immediate and gradual. The constant presence that had shaped every aspect of the environment was no longer there. The cold, once tied so closely to their influence, began to lessen, though not entirely at first. The air, while still carrying the memory of what had been, no longer held the same depth of absence. Light, too, began to return in small and uncertain ways. It did not fill the space all at once, nor did it transform the prison into something welcoming, but it remained where once it would have faded, allowing the structure of the space to be seen more clearly. Shadows no longer stretched in the same unchanging way, and the distinction between one area and another became easier to perceive. For those who remained within the prison, this change altered their experience in ways that could not be immediately measured. The effects of long exposure to the Dementors did not disappear with their absence. The loss of memory, the narrowing of thought, the weakening of identity, these remained as part of what had already taken place. But the process that had sustained these changes was no longer as strong, allowing for a different kind of stillness to emerge. In place of the Dementors, a new system of guards and control was established. Witches and wizards took on roles that had once been unnecessary, maintaining order through observation rather than through the shaping of the environment itself. This introduced a different form of presence within Azkaban, one defined by structure and intention rather than by quiet, constant influence. The rhythm of the prison began to shift as a result. Movement, once limited by the absence of will, now followed more defined pattern. Meals were observed more regularly, routines established where before there had been none. These changes did not restore what had been lost, but they created a framework within which life could continue in a more structured way. For some prisoners, this structure provided a point of reference that had long been absent. The distinction between one moment and another became clearer, and with it, a limited sense of progression. The mind, no longer under the same steady pressure, could begin to form thoughts that extended beyond immediate repetition, though often in fragmented ways. At the same time, the absence of the Dementors revealed the extent to which the prison had depended on them. The quiet control they had provided could not be easily replaced. Maintaining order required effort, coordination, and attention in ways that had not been necessary before. The simplicity of the previous system, for all its cost, had concealed this complexity. Beyond the practical changes, the removal of the Dementors also carried symbolic meaning. It marked a shift in how the wizarding world approached the idea of punishment and control. The reliance on beings that could not be fully guided or limited had been set aside, replaced by methods that, while more demanding, allowed for greater oversight. This shift did not resolve all questions surrounding Azkaban. The prison remained a place of confinement, and the experience of those within it continued to be shaped by isolation and limitation. But the nature of that experience changed, moving away from the quiet erosion of the self and toward a condition that, while still restrictive, allowed for a different kind of existence. Over time, the memory of the Dementors' presence did not disappear. It remained within the structure of the prison, in the stories told about it, and in the understanding of what it had once been. The absence of their influence made that memory more distinct, allowing it to be considered with greater clarity. In this way, the removal of the Dementors did not erase the past, but it marked a point of transition. Azkaban, once defined by a single, unchanging force, became something more complex, shaped by new systems and new understanding. The quiet stillness that remained within its walls was no longer the result of absence alone, but part of a structure that had begun to change. And within that change, there existed the possibility, however limited, that the experience of those confined there might follow a different path than it once had. When considered in its entirety, the presence of the Dementors within the wizarding world revealed something that extended beyond the boundaries of Azkaban itself. They were not only part of a system, nor only a feature of a single place. They reflected a broader pattern, one that showed how power could be used, how control could be maintained, and how the effects of that control could reach further than intended. The decision to rely on the Dementors was, at its core, a decision to accept a method that operated without clear limitation. Their influence was effective, but it was not precise. It did not distinguish between degrees of wrongdoing, nor did it adjust itself based on individual circumstance. It created a condition that applied broadly, shaping all who came within it in similar ways. This lack of distinction suggested something about the nature of the system that used them. It showed that, at times, the desire for control could outweigh the need for balance, that maintaining order could become the primary focus, even when the means of doing so carried consequences that were not fully examined. The quiet nature of those consequences made them easier to overlook, allowing the system to continue without interruption. At the same time, the existence of the Dementors revealed a deeper truth about the relationship between power and understanding. They could not be directed in the way other forces could. They did not respond to instruction in a predictable manner, nor could their influence be precisely measured. To rely on them was to accept a level of uncertainty, to place trust in something that operated according to its own nature. This relationship created a form of imbalance. The system depended on a force that it did not fully control, and in doing so, it allowed that force to shape the experience of those within it in ways that extended beyond intention. The result was a structure that functioned, but carried within it elements that were difficult to reconcile with the principles it was meant to represent. The removal of the Dementors from Azkaban did not erase this history. Instead, it highlighted it. By stepping away from that reliance, the wizarding world acknowledged, even if indirectly, that the previous system had limitations. That effectiveness alone was not enough to define what should be maintained, that the experience of those affected by a system mattered, even when that experience was quiet and difficult to observe. In this way, the Dementors became more than a part of a story. They became a point of reflection, a way to consider how systems are built and how they operate. They showed that power, when used without clear boundaries, can extend into areas that are not immediately visible, shaping not only actions, but thoughts and feelings as well. They also revealed the importance of understanding what lies beneath the surface of a system. The absence of visible conflict within Azkaban did not mean that the system was without cost. The quiet nature of the suffering within it made that cost less apparent, but no less real. It existed in the gradual changes that could not be easily measured, in the steady loss of qualities that defined individual experience. At the same time, the existence of resistance, however limited, showed that such systems are not absolute. There remained points at which their influence could be challenged, not through force alone, but through the presence of something that could not be easily altered. These moments, though rare, suggested that even within a structure defined by control, there could exist elements that did not fully conform to it. As the wizarding world moved forward, the memory of the Dementors and their role within Azkaban remained as part of its understanding, not as something separate, but as a part of its history, one that influenced how future decisions might be made. The knowledge of what had occurred and of how it had shaped those involved became part of the broader consideration of how power should be used. And so, the story of the Dementors did not end with their removal from the prison. It continued in the way their presence was remembered, in the questions they raised, and in the understanding they brought to the nature of control and consequence. They remained, not as a constant force within a single place, but as a quiet reminder of how deeply an unseen influence can shape the world around it. And so, as the quiet of this journey settles, what remains is not a single moment, but an understanding that formed slowly, much like the experience it describes. The Dementors did not simply guard a prison. They shaped a condition, one that reached into memory, into identity, and into the fragile space where hope once rested. Within Azkaban, their presence revealed how much of a person's life exists beyond what can be seen, and how easily that unseen part can be altered when left unprotected. Yet even within that steady darkness, there were small and quiet signs that something could remain. A thought held for a moment longer than expected, a memory that did not fully fade, a sense, however distant, that something beyond the present still existed. These were not enough to change the condition, but they offered a glimpse of what could not be entirely removed. Now, as this story comes to rest, allow it to drift gently away, leaving behind only a calm stillness where thought slows and the quiet becomes complete.